innovations in education, et cetera, just different institutions in our society. The electoral institutions. I don't know how you would do that with a massively decentralized system. So there are criticisms of that. There are definitely criticisms of this sort of more localist view. But I think that we're also in a space where there's this opportunity to create those institutions, to create those bottom-up institutions. And maybe if we do it well with the internet, they'll be a bit more powerful than what came before them on that central national level. Maybe this is an opportunity for humanity to test out some new viable modes of political organization. That's a kind of wild thought. And admittedly, I am not going to go too deep into it right now, partly because I just don't have many more ideas beyond that, but I see it in its broad strokes. But Jamarl, I want to come back to you actually on something specific. Had you seen this it came out earlier this year, 2020 article, I'm seeing it first in the New York Mag, where they're saying that back in 2012, Sanders was considering primarying Barack Obama.
Yeah,
but then he got asked to step back. Have you seen that?
Yeah, he was. I mean, why wouldn't he? I mean, the problem is, the problem is obvious. It's the first black president. And regardless of whether Sanders may focus on the stuff as class, and regardless of whether a lot of people focus on it as class, what people are going to say, I'm guaranteeing you, what Democrats were going to say is, oh my God, how dare you primary the first black president? Now, in the same way, they would say, oh my God, how dare you primary the first female president? Meaning if that was Hillary Clinton. And so whatever Sanders wanted to do, he was to some degree restrained by the mechanics of it. But you understand why he wanted to do it. If it was, let's say, Joe Biden, he would have primaried. Because in his mind, I need to push this guy to the left. Unfortunately, the only thing that the left understands is pressure. They don't understand issues of power. Pressure is, I'm going to push this guy and hope he does something different. Issues of power is, I'm going to take that guy's head off. And not just take that guy's head off, I'm going to subsume his power. However, I need to do it. Now, that is hard to do when a Democrat is already in office, because no other Democrat is going to back you in that. Meaning, if you're in a primary process where the guy's not president, you have two candidates that are running, then everything is on the table that you can use. Even if you're out of the primary process and that guy's not president yet, all of your powers is on table to use to win. Now, the problem is lefties don't understand that. Meaning, if Joe Biden is running and he's in the primaries, your objective is to make him lose. Or at the very least, make him believe that you can make him lose. Because that's the only way you get what you want in regards to getting something accomplished. Now, they'd be horrified by that. You can't do that in a primary where the guy's already in office, unless it's a magnificently unpopular Democrat. You could have never gotten away with that with Obama. So I'm actually glad he didn't try to do that. I think he would have failed miserably, and it would have marred him for 2016. But we do have callers. Let's go to Tarif in New Orleans. Tarif. Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead, Shane.
Well, there's just one maybe two tiny quick comments, and then we should really go to Tarif. One quick comment is, I think that knowing that he tried to do that in 2012 kind of changed how I saw what he did in 2016. It shows that there was a little bit more of a through line in terms of intent. So when you say that, he might have, I forget exactly what you were saying. I don't think he was afraid of not getting elected. I think he was trying to get elected. Some people say that he was a spoiler for Obama, but I don't know why, unless this is all fake and made up after the fact. If he were running as a spoiler for Obama, I don't know why he would have been trying to primary Obama back in 2012. So I kind of would dismiss the spoiler argument just using that as evidence.
Spoiler. I'm saying he wanted to push Obama to the left, just like he wanted to push Clinton to the left. Like in his head, it's I need to push these guys to the left. It's not so much to lose it for Obama. That's not what he wanted.
Oh, I hear you. I wasn't arguing. I've heard other sort of former Bernie supporters argue that. That's all. But if you're down, let's go to Tarif. Didn't mean to interject for too long. Tarif, calling in from New Orleans. Tarif, you're on. What's going on?
How y'all doing? I have two comments and a question. My first comment is dealing from yesterday. We need a committee just to watch over the FBI and also local police officers and sheriffs, and also a committee to watch over prosecutors and coroner's office to go over their files to make sure they're doing everything right. Because not everybody that go in front of prosecutor is guilty. We don't want prosecutors hiding evidence. The prison needs to be reformed where a person go into prison, they don't come out within the next 10 or 20 years worse than they went in. And innocent people that's in prison, cases need to be reviewed and they need to be let go because they are innocent. Okay? And other things dealing with reforms, dealing with the justice system and repealing a whole bunch of other things too. Watched over the FBI as well. Joe Johnson from the Libertarian Party, it's my second comment, is have scored a short list, and she's back. She's put Alan Dershowitz on it. Okay. And my last comment, a question, is the American First Healthcare Plan, what Trump is putting out there, maybe Jamarl or Shane can answer this. Is that similar to the public option? Because I need to know this. That's all I need to say.
I'll be honest, man. I don't know. I need to learn more about
the Trump healthcare plan.
Yeah, specifically the executive order that he announced yesterday. This is my first headline. But yeah, we're in this order. I'm just going to go back and quote here. This is from Trump. He said the plan, quote, extends affordable insurance options, reduces the cost of prescription drugs, will end surprise medical billing, increases fairness through price transparency, streamlines bureaucracy, accelerates innovation, strongly protects Medicare, and always protects patients with pre-existing conditions, end quote. Again, that's all extremely high level, but just to give people an idea
Trump
of the focus
here. As easily as he breathes. And whether people realize this or not, the Affordable Care Act had already made sure that pre-existing conditions was covered. Now, Trump wants to make this kind of argument of, well, technically pre-existing conditions were covered, but what if you were in your 70s and you were paying X amount, you were making $70,000 a year, you're paying X amount for this, and you're paying X amount for this. That's what everybody does already. When I'm saying Medicare for all gets rid of that stuff, it does. Whatever Trump is doing by executive order does not. And if you want to know how flimsy an executive order is, think about the JCPOA. When Donald Trump came in, the next president took a purview that they didn't like it, they got rid of it. So, or for that matter, DACA. And yes, Donald Trump was too incompetent to get rid of it, but any other president that had the sense of a 3-year-old would have been able to get rid of that program by giving just any flimsy reason that they wanted to get rid of it. Executive orders are flimsy, and they do not have the force of law. And so even if it did have the force of law, you're still missing this point of, or the same impact as law, meaning from the standpoint of stick-to-itiveness. But you still have this thing that Obama already did this. And I'm sorry, he wasn't able to get rid of Obamacare, even though he's trying to do it now, trying to do it in courts. And so, no, Trump should not get credit for doing something that the previous president already did, no matter how much Donald Trump wants to say he did.
Let's try this. We've got one more call. Let's go to David calling in from Texas. David, you're on the line. What's going on?
Not much. Me and Hans, we just want you guys to be on the lookout. We got another brother, SB. One of them guys goes by initials. He's a kind of a troublemaker, you know. We just wanted to warn you, let you know. Jawohl, Fort Lyons, is Nazi number one hillbilly for the world. And Hans, he's got a take on Sheriff Bart. Jawohl, you know, Sheriff Bart, he likes for the Fräulein. Jawohl, maybe it's for the great-grandfather. We're going to make for the DNA and check for the reparations. Get off the phone. Say goodbye, Hans. We don't say goodbye. We say, I'm here in Fort Lyons. It's too early in the morning. Adios.
David. All right, David. You know what? I'm going to be honest. I actually do find your calls. I find your calls hilarious. But I'm just going to give you one recommendation. It's a little bit hard to understand what you're talking about, like what story or what point you're making. But other than that, I find your presentation spot on. Your pacing very good. I just want to briefly applaud you for one thing, being brave enough to call in and do these impressions. Anyway, not to give too much away there, but David calling in from Texas. We're going into a break. We'll be back in a minute. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Back on the other side with Ted Rall.
Fault Lines.
You're listening to Radio Sputnik.
Shooting from the left.
We're taking no prisoners here. Real opinions for real people. Where we bring you people with controversial views, and instead of trying to catch them out, we actually...
I got no Ted yet.
...on their views. What's going on in British politics, European politics, and indeed in world politics as well.
And wherever you are, whether you're a UKIP supporter, a Tory or Labour, everything is in turmoil.
John Gaunt.
Shooting from the lip.
Fault Lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Jamarl Thomas. That's my co-host, and myself, Shane Stranahan. And you know what? We're bringing Ted Rall on. I'm going to intro him when he's on, though. I hear that we're still in the process of bringing him on. Yeah, David, again, for those who are listening on the other side of the break, David has called in now a few times with his brother Hans. This was the first appearance of, I think, Hans's brother SB, goes by the initials SP. It's interesting. I'll be honest. I like the fact that we live in this world. I like the fact that, I don't know, I like silliness. Silliness is broadly a good thing. But yeah,
No,
David,
not really.
call in.
This is a political radio show.
Go for it, Jamarl.
This is a political radio show. The guy's calling in to be a troll. He's not calling in to be funny or interesting or anything else. It has nothing to do with anything that's being applied to anything that we're talking about. So people can have their opinions on it. Mine is, I don't particularly like it.
All right. Okay. Well, we can talk about it. I feel like he's calling in to make a joke. I don't think if he's trolling, I don't think he's trolling us. And I'm okay with people trolling people we don't like, within bounds.
I mean, Shane, can you even understand what he's saying?
I did. The only thing that he's saying stuff about Fraulein instead of saying goodbye, he should be saying Auf Wiedersehen. Like, you could definitely work on some of the pronunciation stuff to make it more palatable to an American ear. But, he makes when he was calling in before, he was talking about how Israel should set up an anti-ICBM system so that basically we could denuclearize. That's an interesting take. I haven't heard people, I have heard people making that take. It's just been a while since I've heard it. And, it's thought provoking. My point is, it's an amusing sort of discursion or something like that. And I don't know, but I'll let you, we can talk about it.
Teach his own, I suppose. Teach his own. We're different people. Exactly. We're going to have different ideas on this stuff. But to me, it wasn't necessarily all that clever. It could have been said in straight English and everybody would have understood it, as opposed to put it in this kind of weird, odd way that wasn't even German. When Ted Rall comes, look, the thing that we're going to talk to Ted Rawls about is about a report that came out that was actually really interesting. It got into this notion of the different voting trends. Basically, younger African-American voters were far more dubious of the Democratic Party as opposed to older voters. Older voters not just were in the camp of the party, but loved the party, believed in it. And the numbers were extraordinary in regards to the differences. I mean, it was like 30-point differences between the various groups in regards to the party. And this was put out by, what was it? It wasn't Daily Beast. It wasn't Morning Consult. Morning Consult usually comes out with interesting polls like this. I need to find the immediate poll. But basically, all the way down the line, you had, 538 was people put it up. You had a distrust or a distrust of the party from the standpoint of younger African Americans as opposed to older African Americans. I mean, for example, is Trump racist? That was kind of believed on both sides of it. Trump is incompetent. That was believed on both sides. But when you get into the notion of the number of people who are going to vote Democrat versus Trump, well, you had a much higher skew in regards to a younger demographic, those willing to go that route, as opposed to an older demographic. And I've known this in my own experiences. When you're talking to older African-American voters, they were very clear that you got to keep Trump out of office. You got to keep the Republican out of office. You get to the younger demographic, and they are less hit on that. They're less certain about that. So, for example, if you get into 30 and 44-year-olds, you have the number of African-American voters that are voting Trump. Now, by the time you get to 65 and older, that number goes to almost like single digits. By the time you're an 18 to 29-year-olds, that number goes into, double digits that are willing to either back Trump or entertain the thing of Trump. And so this year, you're going to have about 10% of the voters going for Trump. And many of those voters are going to be part of the younger demographic. I'm not sure if Ted Rall is on yet. Is Ted Rall back yet?
Nope.
Okay.
He is not.
Okay. So let's go through the chart for a moment. And when Ted Rall joins us, he joins us. So from 18 to 29-year-olds, the ones that are backing Biden, there's about 60%, 65% backing Biden, with about 10% backing Trump. 65 and older, you get 85% and 90% backing Biden, with maybe like 3% backing Trump. And with even the part that's backing Trump, there's a good 20% that's up in the air, that's uncertain. That is a dramatic difference, either from the standpoint of a youth versus age skew. And what does that mean for one Joe Biden if those kids aren't all that interested in one Joe Biden. And they wake up that morning and decide to not go to the polls. Should Joe Biden be taking this demographic so cavalier?
Oh, no, no. I mean, here's the thing, though. We're talking about this in the context of, black and brown people. I think white people, people of any, if you're getting younger in the States, if you were recently born, in other words, you're less likely to trust institutions. I think this applies across the base. Maybe I'm wrong, but this is what arguably put Donald Trump into power. Specifically, this is, as far as I can tell, the left's narrative is that you had a bunch of white right-wingers who elected Donald Trump because they were dissatisfied with the state of things as they are. They were dissatisfied with the status quo of the Republican Party. I just think that's endemic. I think if you're young and you're growing up in our society, it's hard not to see the decay all around you. It's hard not to feel it on a deeper sense when you hear stories from your parents about, we keep bringing it back to it, but about the moon landing, about these sort of categorical attempts at achievement that we successfully did. And so, if you're young, if you're growing up in this,
I think people need to give your point more credence.
I don't think you have the vestiges of confidence.
I think people need to give your point more credence. For example, not just the moon landing, but this notion of achievement and accomplishment. And you're doing so not in this kind of individualistic company way. Amazon is going to make $1 trillion. Great for Amazon. But I'm talking about specifically for us as a country and us as a civilization. Meaning, whatever Kennedy, and whatever the reason and rationale Kennedy went to the moon, and yes, it was a lot of militaristic stuff built into it. There was also this aspect of euphoric humanism. I mean, am I wrong on that? Basically, we are going to take a body from this world, and we're going to go into a hostile environment that wants to kill us constantly, meaning the vacuum of space, and we're going to put it on another planet. Not for any other reason than we can. That's profound. And, there's no reason to do anything per se. I mean, that's not true. There's all sorts of reasons to do things, but I guess I'm making the point that we as a species, as a civilization, choose. That's all there is, choice. And in that, we chose to do something that was profound and expansionist and euphoric in this kind of human expansionistic way. And we were successful at it. We were able to do it. We accomplished it. And then the next thought becomes, okay, what else? Do we go to Mars? Is there other planets that we could go to and set foot on? Not because we have to, but because we can. Because this is one of the things that we can do with our human ingenuity and our intellect. Well, that's euphoric when you think of it in those terms. And you start looking to the sky and think, okay, what else? Well, part of that, though, is you got to deal with the real tangible issues that are availing you as human beings. And so I do think there's something to be said about looking up, but I do think the looking up has to deal with also, okay, what about our tangible requirements as human beings before we can ever get to the point of saying, okay, we're going to put foot on somewhere else. Because look, I think the majority of humanity will be okay with that as long as they weren't hungry, as long as you didn't have them ill, as long as you didn't have these things where they didn't have a house or were struggling to get a house. I agree with you, I think, in grand strokes of there should be something expansive to look forward to, not entirely this thing of just basically trying to make ends meet. The catch becomes, how do you do that? I even agree with you from a technological standpoint that we should be looking at this stuff thinking, okay, what's the next issue? What's the next problem? And how do we solve it? I think those are conceptual issues, though. And I don't know how you get man to wrap themselves in the point of view that part of their issue should be solving practical concerns and expanding beyond those concerns. Does it make sense?
I think we are. I just think we're caught in this system. I mean, we're caught in this system. Some people will use the word capitalism to describe parts of that system, and other people will criticize the role that governments play. I mean, governments historically have been, as far as I can tell, the major perpetrators of evil, simply because they've been the tool of power that people have abused against other people. What is it? The quote from Robbie Burns, the Scottish poet: "Man's inhumanity to man makes countless thousands mourn." And that's hundreds of years old. That's the thing that has always driven us to the greatest levels of despair has been what other people have done to us, and the vehicle through which they've done it is historically, as far as I can tell, then governments or something approaching, the level of a government in terms of state power. It's uniquely in the modern era, I think, that capitalism, the sort of sphere of private organizational activity or whatever, that through the developments of laws and technologies, you've allowed for the creation of these large extra governmental behemoths, and then those behemoths have started to do some bad things too. I think that's sort of where we're living, but I don't want to forget that governments can do bad things too. But this is where it comes down to leadership and wisdom. And these are like the oldest ideas of political philosophy, at least in the West, as far as I can tell. You go back to it and they look at what is the quality? What are the sort of moral qualities of the leader? How can you make sure that the person you're electing has those moral qualities, or the person that you're supporting? If it's not an election, if it's an aristocracy or a monarchy or something, how can you sort of increase and preserve levels of virtue in whatever sphere of elites or representation you're going to have over yourself? I think we need to come back to that. I mean, and you're talking about this is a conceptual thing. Honestly, having some sense of wisdom. We got into a thing back and forth about ideology, and we could go there, but it feels a little bit boring to go back into it. But yeah, that's my take. I don't mean to beat a dead horse with this stuff about wisdom and leadership.
That leadership is not the problem. The leadership is the problem. Provocative, yes. But if you think of leaders over the course of time, those leaders, some have been good, and maybe we give too much credence to the ones that are good. Some have also been monstrous. Every bit as much as a leader as FDR was, so was Hitler. Hitler just led their country into basically a fire. He wasn't alone in that, though. And that's the thing that people always point out. They always point at Hitler as he was the end all be all. But think of all of the mechanisms that had to take place for him to do what he did. Think of all of the laws. Think of all of the people that had to rah-rah the system and the way the system was operating. Think of all of the little functionaries that were sitting there that was doing a particular job that he would button yes or no, and that yes or no would end up sending people to death or not. Like, for all of the leaders that were successful in regards to doing something good, we also have to accept that many were successful in doing things that were monstrous. And we often forget the ones that were monstrous. I guess I'm making the point that is it leadership or is it a public that gets into his head, this is where we need to go? Meaning go beyond just this one individual that's leading people or pushing people in one direction or the other, but is also getting to this thing of the public recognizing there is a way of going about this, and there's a way that is disastrous. And the way that's disastrous, regardless of who's up there saying, let's go this route or that route, can lead to bad ends. And that maybe what we need and what we require is somewhat of a mass, public understanding of things. Not necessarily this one individual that's taking us point A to point B, but a public that gets into his head based on historical context. This is not where we need to go. I don't know how you get there. And maybe the earlier version and iteration of this is a leader. Maybe you need that in the beginning. This guy who says, let's go this way or that way, or this woman that says, let's go this way or that way, until the public can get it into his own head of, hey, maybe this is not the way we need. But let's do this. Let's take a break. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We're going to get Shane's comment when we come back. And you guys stay tuned.
Fault Lines. Epidemics and pandemics could kill millions of people, and they actually did. Centuries ago, deadly outbreaks called the Black Death, the Plague of Justinian, and the Spanish flu ravaged countries, empires, and whole continents. Some of these diseases are still present around the globe. Others have become a thing of the past. Discover how these ancient and not so distant outbreaks from previous centuries differ from modern-day SARS, MERS, and coronavirus pandemics. Listen to our new series, Outbreak, the deadliest epidemics in human history, this week on Radio Sputnik. Fault Lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Jamarl Thomas. That's my co-host, and myself, Shane Stranahan. And if you've been listening, you'll probably be able to guess what's about to come. We're taking calls. 202-521-1320 is the number to call. Again, that number is 202-521-1320. By the way, I'm going to do this a little bit of just an announcement here. If you want to listen to us on the radio and you're in the DC area, you can listen to us there on 105.5 FM and 1390 AM. If on the other side of things, if you're closer to the middle of the country in Kansas City, we're on 102.9 FM, 104.7 FM, and 1140 AM. Also, we're online in at least 6 different places, arguably 7. I'll do the audio options first. We have 5 different sort of audio podcast places to find us. We're over on Spreaker, Stitcher, iHeartRadio, Apple Music, and Spotify. And then on video, our only option right now this morning, as far as I can tell, if you go to youtube.com and then search for Fault Lines Radio, we'll find the official Fault Lines Radio channel. If you subscribe to that every morning, you'll get a little notification thingy that tells you that, we're live, which we are from 7 to 10 a.m. Eastern, 4 to 7 a.m. Pacific. So those are our options. By the way, don't just subscribe to our channel, but if you're going over to YouTube, you should, like that video, share it if you want to, maybe comment in the chat. We have a very active chat community over on our Fault Lines Radio YouTube channel with some inveterate, longtime fans. In any event, we're taking calls, 202-521-1320. You can call in if you want to. Jamarl, here's the thing. You were talking about a sort of mass public. This is going to be an interesting debate. I've been opposed to mass politics for a long time because I'm worried that it simplifies and trivializes the way that people think about politics and reduces them to members of this sort of homogeneous mass. You need, if you're going to have a central government and if you're going to have representational democracy within that government, if it's going to be happening on a high level, then you need to do mass politics. You need to organize people either within parties or sort of within spheres of concern, unless you're doing direct democracy, in which case, you can think of people as just more or less atomized constituents of this very, very large system with no real organizational capacity or anything like that, no real affinities. If you don't want to do that kind of direct democracy, you need something like parties. You need something like mass political participation. But what you get as the result of that, as far as I can tell, is a more or less intentional dumbing down of the public. Because inevitably what happens is as power gets concentrated in the hands of a smaller number of elites, they use that power to try to suppress forms of dissent by miseducating, misinforming people, basically keeping them from coming into, wisdom and truth for themselves. Which, it's not like humanity historically has had a direct tap into wisdom and truth. We've made plenty of mistakes throughout history. So I'm not saying that government comes in and messes everything up for us, but I think that, government can tend to do that. You referenced Hitler. Totalitarian states tend to misinform people, and what you get are mass political parties supporting demagogues. And I don't like that, and it doesn't seem to work out well. But what's your take on that, Jamarl?
I mean, Germany is not huge. I mean, if you're talking about, let's say, like the UK is not huge. It's like an island nation. Despite it not being huge, you still get mass deception from the way of the political leaders. I mean, for example, if you had a situation, let's say like Virginia, let's say none of the states came together under the United States. And even under the United States, these states are still their own little things. They just don't have control of their currency. And so they can be manipulated or pushed by the federal government. And they have their own powers. Let's say it that way. But you would basically have Virginia fighting Georgia. I mean, like they came together, not just, it wasn't just for no reason. I mean, even when you're looking at the European Union, why do you think they formed a stronger or larger body? Because they realized that as smaller individual entities, they would be picked off by larger countries, either China or the United States. What do you think is happening with the UK right now? It's being picked off by larger institutions, be it the European Union that is going to rake it over the coals, or the United States, which is going to do the same. Not to mention smaller bodies. How do you have a smaller body solution to climate change? You don't. I mean, the usage of resources, the determination of how resources are going to be used for the interests of the whole, all of those things go out the window when you're just functioning from these kind of smaller bodies. Don't misunderstand me. I understand where you're coming from. Your point is, it's easier to hold a government accountable when it's a smaller government. So if we're just talking about what's taking place, let's say in Maryland, or what's taking place in Virginia, you have a clearer picture of that because you're closer to it, as opposed to something like the federal government where you don't have a clear picture of the smaller individual items that are taking place. Ideally, though, the reason that you have the larger government is not because you expect things to go wrong. It's more so you have an expectation that they're going to do things right. And maybe from that more of a cynical interpretation, you can hold government accountable better. Do you understand what I mean? Like when we're thinking about government, oftentimes what we're indoctrinated into is this thing, regardless of the things that go wrong, they're basically trying to do what's right. So Trump in office is really trying to do what's right, even though you know in real terms that's not true. Or Joe Biden, when he gets in office, he's really trying to do what's right. Well, you know, in real terms, that's not really what's true. They're doing what's in the interest for them or the interest of their constituencies, which is basically a small body of elites. The catch becomes, how do you fix that? And how do you fix that in a way where you don't necessarily have to break things down into these incrementalist governments of, okay, now you've just functioned from the point of Virginia? I think that's the larger question, right? I mean, it's not so much taking the entirely cynical interpretation that there's no way to deal legitimately and honestly with a larger body and larger institution. And so there's no point in creating those things. I'm saying, I think, even though I think I understand where that argument comes from, I'm saying I think that's the wrong argument. How do you hold your political institutions accountable, even when they're large political institutions, acknowledging that you need that heft to some degree to get larger things accomplished in a world that is not specifically and tiny anymore? Does that make sense? Or do you think I'm being unfair in that approach, in that argument?
So I'll put it like this. We're arguing from sort of two, not from the opposite ends. We're not arguing from the extremes of a spectrum, but we're arguing, from points along a spectrum where I'm on one point and you're on another point. And I would define that spectrum as something like local political power. My end of the spectrum is more local political power, and your end of the spectrum is something like more centralized political power.
Yes.
And I can understand the arguments you're making, and we can talk back and forth. I guess I like the fact that we're arguing along the spectrum. And
Let me ask you this. What is a local solution to climate change?
I'll put it like this. What if you had the central government dispersing some money to local municipalities that gave people land for free in order to greenify that land, do water infiltration practices, the building of swales, various permacultural practices? What if you did this in line with a wave of roboticization so that you could do intensely diverse polycultural
I'm not against that,
crops?
Shane. I'm not against that. You already know you had me at hello. You had me at hello.
Okay,
but the catch is you're still talking
most of the decisions
federal.
there. But most of the decisions there are being made locally. There's some stuff being done centrally, and I'm not saying we should eradicate the central government or federal control, but I'm saying as much as we can, it will be far better for the average person, and in the long run, I believe it would be far better for that government too, the central government, if more and more of the decisions were made locally. If as much as you can, you try to help people to educate themselves and grow wiser in the use of their power, because if you get that, if you move in that direction, then in some sense you're moving towards the dream of real humanism, which is people coexisting, each pursuing their own vision of what's right and what's true, but in some sort of harmony. And again, I'm painting an extremely, extremely rosy picture here, but that's where I would go with that. What's your take, Jamarl?
I'm not against that. I guess the issue here is your federal government and the powers that it has are normal under normal circumstances. People want to accrue more power in general, right? They want to have the agency to do what they want. And if you're the federal government, over time, what we've seen is that level of that mendacity of needing that additional power grows, not lessens. And so it's like, even though I understand the picture that you're trying to paint, that takes a certain point of view that is to some degree shared, at the very least amongst government, in order to even get them in that mindset of saying, yeah, we're going to devolve powers. Or it takes those states and the people of those states to demand you need to devolve powers. But you can't, but it can't be, somebody has to have the mindset. That's kind of what I always get at. Somebody has that mindset.
I have the mindset, Jamarl.
Well, okay, not somebody.
Are you?
The preponderance of people have to have a mindset that boils down to that. Is that fair?
I'm talking on the radio, and I want more people to think this way. That's how I'll put it. But we've got two calls. Are you down to go to them?
Yeah, totally.
All right. Let's go to Michael calling in from Silver Spring. Michael, you're on the line. What's going on?
Good morning. The moon question is interesting. My question, I agree, it's interesting that the government is evolving itself into this project. My question for that one is, why isn't the government searching for heaven? If you're going out there, I don't hear anything about the what's going on into outer space. They're not looking for heaven. because it's written on all the dollar bills, "In God we trust," and I think it's relevant. And then the second thing about starting on the the local level regarding this new wave, this technology that we now have that they didn't have when they were forming the government in, the 1700s, is why not just have a website exactly like YouTube with a thumbs up button for "I agree with this bill," or whatever this thing, or a "yes, no, I don't agree." And that way people are represented on the local level, etc. Those are my questions.
You're talking about, so the second one, you're talking about direct democracy. We can go back and forth on that. We don't have enough time. That would be better for another day. Thank you for the call. Jamarl, you want to come back on that, or should we move to the next call?
I mean, do people really want direct democracy? Look, when I get up in the morning, I would love if my coffee was just made, or if my tea was just made. I would love for my trash to just be automatically picked up. I don't necessarily want to have to talk about it constantly. And I wonder if people are similar, meaning they want their water to be clean, they want their air to be clean, they want their streets to be clean, meaning they want this stuff. They don't necessarily want to have to continuously haggle about it, which is why, to some degree, I would say the representative democracy thing may have its virtues. By the same token, the negatives of it is there are plenty of things that they may want to give their opinion on that they can't. So I don't know, I don't know where people would entirely fall on that if they had to continuously haggle about, all right, this is how we're going to get our water clean. And it's like, oh God, do I really have to go to that meeting today? Or do they want to live their life and have that stuff done? I strongly suspect they want to live their life and have that stuff done, even though they may want to have it done in a certain way. So, look, I don't know, that's the haggle between representative versus elect. And I'm not entirely sure where people would fall. I think I would probably fall, believe it or not, more so on representative, because I don't want to have those fights constantly about things that should be done a particular way, which kind of, brings you back to the direct democracy thing when you want them done a particular way. We have one more caller, Linda. Linda from New Mexico. Linda, what's going on?
I feel like, wait. We do not have enough time, Jamarl. I feel like we've got like 30 seconds before we've got to go to a break. I don't think we would have enough time. Linda, I'm sorry that we didn't get to you. I'm going to ask you to call back in about 10 minutes. We're going to be taking calls in another 10 minutes. So unless you want to hang out on the phone lines there, I don't want to keep you tethered. Just call back in then, and we'll definitely take you. Again, sorry we didn't get to it. And by the way, I lived in New Mexico for a little while in Los Lunas. I really miss the Hatch salsa. You guys have the most delicious salsa in the world, bar none. With that, we're going to go into a break. You've been listening to Fault Lines with Jamarl Thomas and Shane Stranahan. We will be back in a minute on the other side of this break with headlines. Be right back.
Listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Fault Lines.
Live from the divided states of America, welcome to your daily inoculation for propaganda. In the left corner, I am the indefatigable, ever vigilant, the last antibody to a sick and seizing political system, your political analyst, Jamarl Thomas.
And in the zenith, I am your political analyst, Shane Stranahan.
You are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. In the news, President Donald Trump signed an executive order he calls his, quote, vision for healthcare, unquote, speaking about it from an aircraft hangar in North Carolina yesterday, saying the plan extends affordable insurance options, reduces costs of prescription drugs, will end surprise medical billing, increase fairness through price transparency, streamlines bureaucracy, accelerates innovation, strongly protects Medicare, and always protects patients with pre-existing conditions. Unquote. It does all that. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi retaliated, saying that President's been in office nearly 4 years. He's been talking about supporting pre-existing conditions. He hasn't done anything about it. We have been very much willing to work with him. Critics say the President's executive order will not bear the weight of law. That's not critics, that is a flat fact. It's the difference between an executive order and a law. Protests continued in Louisville, where protesters are angry that no homicide charges have been filed in the killing of Breonna Taylor, a 26-year-old EMT who was shot by police and marched as they barged through her home, shooting her multiple times as her boyfriend retaliated, believing they were intruders. The late Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg will lie in state in the Capitol building today, where she will be the first woman and the first Jewish American to lie in state. Ginsburg will be buried at Arlington National Cemetery on Tuesday. A federal court in California is halting the Trump administration's plan to stop counting for the 2020 census earlier this year, ordering that the census continue for another month. The Justice Department has said it will appeal the decision. Results from the U.S. Census delivered by the Constitution are used to measure political participation and disperse federal funding for the next decade. Facebook and Twitter said they've removed several hundred Russian-backed accounts. Facebook head of security policy said that while these accounts did not focus on the United States, had gained little following, and had not directly targeted the 2020 election, that they are linked to actors associated with the election interference of the United States in the past, quote unquote. Specifically, the leak of the hacked emails for the Democratic National Committee and Hillary Clinton's campaign 4 years ago. The networks mainly focus on Syria, Ukraine, Turkey, and Belarus. Breaking news from this morning, at least 4 have been injured in France as a man wielding a machete went on a stabbing spree near Charlie Hebdo's former headquarters. Charlie Hebdo is a former French magazine which drew national or international criticism and support for its depiction of Mohammed on the French page back in 2006, and the new depiction of Mohammed in 2012 before its headquarters were attacked by Islamist gunmen in 2015, killing 12 staff members. On September 1st of this year, the magazine republished the cartoons ahead of a trial against the suspected gunmen. The trial is ongoing. North Korea's leader, Kim Jong-un, issued an apology after his troops shot and killed a South Korean fisherman official. It was thought that it had been trying to defect. Kim Jong-un said he was greatly sorry, quote unquote, for the unsavory incident of our waters. Farmers across India are blocking roads and railways in protest of farm bills, which they say would dismantle the minimum support price system of the country, leaving them at the mercy of large corporations. The main roads around Delhi are blocked, as well as those around Bangalore, with farmers rallying with tractors and water buffalo. Wow. You're all caught up. That is your news. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. You know, the interesting one, I'm always enamored by the differences in cadence of different countries. Like, so we may say something in the United States. We say it a particular way. People hear it a particular way. We get used to it. South Korea or North Korea says something, and it's put in this kind of weird, flowery, over-the-top rhetoric. And we look at that and be like, wow, why is that guy talking like that? Missing the point that that's the way they communicate. It's the differences in language variances and the way they get across language in the various countries, whether you're in Europe or whether you're in other countries, let's say like India or North Korea, etc. The language comes across in a different way to us in the way that we hear it. That's why I was enamored by the North Korea one, and saying, you know, I'm greatly sorry for the unsavory incident in our waters. The Brits, if you ever listen to them and the way they talk, same thing. What's his name? The guy, Burkow, that was head of the parliament. He would talk in those ways, but he would do it on the fly. And you'd be like, wow, I can't believe that he's talking that way. And he would do so just because of the way they would talk, and the way they would use language. So one of the other stories I want to get to, I don't want to get to the Facebook removing things. I mean, they removed Press TV, if I'm not mistaken. That was an Iranian news agency. How do you do that? Like, how are you Twitter and you remove a press agency from another country? It's as if they expect a press agency from Iran to give talking points from America, and because they don't do that, they get annoyed by it and say, okay, we're going to take these guys off of Twitter. Is Twitter just a United States organization or are they an international organization? And I think they need to really think deeply about what I'm asking here. Are you there purely as an outlet for U.S. interests, or are you there as an outlet for everyone's interests? And if it's for everyone, and if it's international, by definition, you would have opinions and depictions of the world that you, as your organization, may disagree with because you are a U.S. organization. You need to examine what you are. And I don't say this, flippantly. I say this because Iranian news may have a point of view that's different than what America is saying. By the same token, Donald Trump is your president, and Donald Trump lies as easily as he's breathing. Is your objective for the truth, or is your objective entirely to pitch America point of view? And Facebook needs to encounter that also. I mean, this goes to the whole Israel-Palestinian issue. Palestinian websites being attacked or removed. And it's like, well, wait a minute. Will they have a point of view that's different from America's point of view, considering America's point of view is in line with Israel? These are political points and political dispositions. This have nothing to do with reality. Is your organization there entirely for politics, or is your organization there to get some level of the truth out? I mean, this is dramatically important. When something happens across the world and they depict it and they show it on Twitter, is Twitter going to show it? Or is Twitter going to say, we don't like this point of view because this gets a point of view that is against what America is saying, despite the fact that it is literally happening? I'm saying this for the burning of the crops in Syria, where American troops are doing that. Now, does Twitter show that? Or does Twitter say, we don't like that because this is depicting American troops doing something that is heinous, despite the fact that the President of the United States ordered it? They're trying to starve off a certain population. You need to question what your organizations, what these institutions are, whether it's Facebook, whether it's Twitter, or Amazon, or whatever else. Are they entirely there for American interests? Or are they there to give the truth about what happens around the world? And look, be honest about it. That way the public will know it. But of course, they're not going to be honest about it. Twitter is going to say they're here for depicting what's taking place across the world, and they're not necessarily going to show that they're in the camp of one side or the other. What do you think about it, Shane? Am I being too harsh here on our institutions? These, these new areas of our sandboxes, the places to which we now give our political discourse. Am I being too harsh on them? Or should those organizations really come out and say, yeah, this is what we're here for?
No, this is disgusting. You're not being harsh enough, in my opinion. These are not sandboxes. These are sandcastles that they built and are trying to protect at all costs. They've just let us in for a little bit in exchange for showing us ads every once in a while. I mean, yeah, we don't own these things. It was a mistake to assume that we ever did. There's no real control by us. There's mostly control over us through these. And so if you're using them, I mean, I'm on Facebook, I'm on Twitter, I'm on the two platforms that we're talking about. But yeah, I'm going to criticize them pretty harshly. They should not be suppressing speech. I mean, I understand there are arguments about whether or not they should be held liable. The government's certainly been cracking down on them. The last 4 or 5 years has been a chorus of people calling for social media to censor more, as far as I can tell. That's been the loudest voice in the room, certainly is calling for more censorship. But that's disgusting. It tickles my gallbladder. It induces nausea. And that's my take on it. Yeah. And we're taking calls. 202-521-1320.
Nausea. I think the problem here is we don't have any space for public discourse. That is not, in the old days, you would have the town crier or the guy who would get up there and just on the sandbox and just, spew his whatever. You can see it in Washington, D.C. now, if you go there. There's always somebody up there saying something. But the problem here and the difference is we're in a technological era, which means that the moment that somebody's voice gets articulated on some kind of airwaves, you can hear it across the world in an instant. Now, there are benefits to that, and of course, there are detriments to that. Part of the benefits to that is a public can, to some degree, get a better idea on what that public is thinking, providing there is some kind of fair metric to do so. Polling often is put out in order to push people in a direction, not necessarily to give public opinion. And at this point, in a political space, you have all sorts of people who use these networks, not to give off real discourse, but to push. For example, in our political campaigns, you would have Clinton back in 2016, or for that matter, maybe even Trump, buying up people to go on Twitter and say really bad things about their candidates and other candidates. Now, at this point, clearly, it's not the individuals that are saying it. It's not real people who are going out and say, this is my political opinion. It becomes people who have all sorts of means and all sorts of cash to basically pay people to do it. We are trying to push people's opinion, not necessarily to get the real public's opinion. And unfortunately, it's kind of hard to figure out a way around that. What was the political campaign? Was it Democrats who were doing this? I think it was Democrats in this going, I believe it was trying to make it look like the Russians were intervening in a network. I forget the campaign this was in. And you look at this and you're like, oh God, that's horrific. That's disgusting. But why were they doing it? They had a rational reason for doing it. They were trying to push people's opinions in a particular direction to get them to vote one way or the other, because their person getting a power mattered more than what the public actually wanted. This is the era that we're in. And it's like, how do you get the benefits without the negatives? And that's something I don't necessarily think we know yet. I think technology moves so fast.
Are you talking about the...
No, go ahead.
Are you talking about the Internet Research Agency? Is that what you're talking about, that story?
That's it, yeah. That's it.
Yeah, that one was ridiculous, where they spent, I forget what it was, but like $100-something thousand. They'd accused these like Russian associated accounts that were created by this Internet Research Agency, which they tenuously linked to Vladimir Putin. They were going after them for posting controversial memes about like hats. And then, I mean, I don't mean to like, downplay this too much, but there was also some protest. I think it was in Twin Falls, Idaho, where they were trying to set up opposite sides. It's hilarious. It's especially hilarious is for me because this was like one of the big coups supposedly in the Russiagate narrative, where we proved it. It's the Internet Research Agency, this Russian associated account, and it's ridiculous. They spend I don't even know how many hundreds of millions of dollars every year, literally on propaganda, trying to get Americans to elect another lame duck president, and then they go after this Internet Research Agency, as far as I can tell, not directly associated with the Russian state. They go after it just because it's in Russia, because it fits their narrative. If that's what you're talking about, yeah, that was a travesty.
There are two things. So, no, this was a Democratic organization that was doing this in order to try to make it look like Russian accounts. The Internet Research Agency was the group that they were trying to say was associated with Russia. Now, Chris Hayes brought an expert on to talk about this, and that expert was aghast by what they were saying, because they were trying to argue that this organization, Twitter, Facebook memes, Jesus and masturbation ads, was somehow equivalent to the $1 billion that Hillary Clinton was putting into ads. And by the way, this agency was in function and action long before the election. I asked people what makes more sense, that a private institution was using the U.S. election to get clicks, meaning we do it too. Like when the election comes around, what happens? The U.S. media starts talking about the election. Why? Because that's of interest. That's the thing that people are focusing on. When my channel and the election comes around, my channel tends to get higher because it's a political channel that's talking about the election. Same difference. Well, you have this institution that puts out memes dealing with the election, and people's like, right there. They were influencing the election. The few $100,000 that they put in, most of which took place after the election, somehow got Donald Trump elected. Missing the point that Clinton was paying, like $1 billion? I mean, she had $1 billion campaign. And a large share of that money, millions, went into internet stuff. So it's like, this is the stuff that they had people trying to believe in. And, so it was that propaganda. But no, there was ads going out from a company that was trying to use the Russia thing as a way of trying to get and attack one of the candidates in the Republican Party. But let's do this. Let's go to a break. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We'll be back in a moment.
Fault Lines. Want to talk? Get in touch with us at radio@sputniknews.com.
Shooting from the lip.
We're taking no prisoners here. Real opinions for real people. Where we bring you people with controversial views, and instead of trying to catch them out, we actually let them expand on their views.
What's going on in British politics, European politics, and indeed in world politics as well. And wherever you are, whether you're a UKIP supporter, a Tory or Labour, everything is in turmoil.
John Gaunt.
Shooting from the lip.
Fault Lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Jamarl Thomas and Shane Stranahan. And we are taking calls. 202-521-1320 is the number to call if you want to call us. Again, that number is 202-521-1320. Maybe this would be boring, but maybe I can do it even slower sometimes so that if you have a pen and paper out, you'll actually have time to do it without taxing your working memory. Without much further ado, we've got Anthony from Detroit on. Anthony calling in. What's on? What's going on?
Guys, hey, just two things I wanted to I guess touch on. I just wanted to say in response to the point Jamarl made about direct democracy, because I totally agree. For a lot of people, it isn't something that they would want to all the time spend their time on. And so I agree with that sentiment. And I think we also have to acknowledge the other side of the coin, which has us, questioning this in the first place, is the way that people's power is usurped and taken from them. And we also have to acknowledge that for those people that don't want that, I think the simple solution to appease both parties would be to make it an option. My goal is to abolish the Michigan State Legislature. I'm working in Detroit with some local organizations. That's my personal goal, and so that's just one of the goals. But I think if you simply make it an option, allow people to come in if they want to, vote on legislation, and then, if they don't, then they don't have to. And of course, you have to establish some baseline financial security so that everybody equally has the opportunity to do so. And since I saw we're talking about Breonna Taylor, the only thing from not the only thing, but the biggest thing from that I have a question about is the reliance on one sole witness to corroborate the police's story. I'm really curious. I haven't seen any media really hammering that home and really questioning that. And so I'm curious if you guys have any take on that. These other witnesses, where are they? Who are they? And why aren't we hearing their stories? Why is it eyewitness testimony has been shown to be not reliable. So why is it one witness, and why are we really accepting that?
It's not so much that we're accepting
also,
it.
Anthony,
it doesn't even matter. And thank you for the call. I totally appreciate it. It doesn't matter. Basically, the problem is that the prosecution came up with, because I strongly suspect they were trying to find anything that they could use to prosecute the cops over this, because they understood what was going to happen if they came back with, we're not going to charge them with anything. That place would have burned to the ground. And you could have had all the cops out there you want. You could have had a state of emergency. That place would have burned to the ground. They were looking for anything. The problem is that the boyfriend shot back. And the moment that the boyfriend shot back, it became, well, the cops have every right to defend themselves. That's the thought. That's the process. You could go with the no-knock warrant. It didn't matter if the person heard it or not. Does the cop, or do those cops have a right to defend themselves? And beyond that, is the no-knock warrant legal in and of itself? If it is legal, then it's fair game. Those cops can go in. They don't have to announce themselves. If it's not legal, then you have a different question of whether or not the cops should be able to break it down. The problem is, from a standpoint of law, they're looking at it and says the no-knock is illegal. And, that's the ghastly part of this. The part wasn't, look, the issue, it is that Breonna was killed. But the question becomes, do cops have the right to do that? If the no-knock warrant is legal, then them going in is a legal thing. And they are just being told to do so by some kind of governmental body, in which case you can't condemn them for doing their jobs. As ghastly as that is. If the no-knock is not legal, okay, then fair enough, you can prosecute them. But again, who are you prosecuting here? If they thought they were going in under a legal device, then you can't go after the cops for doing what they did. And the moment that the boyfriend shot back, if it is again legal, then they have every right to respond. I find that ghastly. The court system apparently did not. And so the only guy that they could prosecute is the guy that missed. Think about that. The guy that gets prosecuted. It's not the guy that hits Breonna Taylor. The people that fired and shot her were doing fair game. The guy that missed was the guy that was being irresponsible. Ergo, he's the one that gets prosecuted. Yeah, that's gross. And your system, and your problem at that is, what's wrong with your system that says that's fair game? And that's where you need to function at. Because at this point, they've said that the cops were clear. Shane?
Wait, is Anthony still on the line?
Can you guys
Anthony,
hear
are
me?
you still there?
Yeah,
I can hear you. Okay, wonderful. You're still here. Yeah. Okay, so, real quick take. You're right. We were talking about this yesterday. 11 of the 12 witnesses say they did not hear anything. The way that I view that, because I just don't know what the heck happened, I'm going to assume there was something, but it was quiet. I mean, that's an assumption, admittedly. It's either there was something or there was nothing. So either they knocked, they made some announcement of their entrance, their impending entrance, or they didn't. But if they did, and 11 out of the 12 witnesses said they didn't hear it, then that probably wasn't enough. So you're right, though. I haven't heard, when I've looked around in the media, I haven't read it talked about quite enough, that literally 11 of the 12 witnesses said they didn't hear anything. And this is, again, after there was this confusing back and forth where originally it was a no-knock warrant, and then shortly before the order was executed, it got switched to a knock warrant. So anyway, there's a conversation there. But actually, because you're on, why are you trying to I'm just curious. Why are you trying to disband the Michigan state legislature? Could you go back into that for a second? Just an interesting, interesting thing.
I just want to say in response to the Breonna Taylor thing before we move away from that, because the details that I've been reading about the timeline of events are more or less kind of what you said, what you guys are saying about the confusion over the knocking. And so the report, according to Kenneth Walker, Taylor's boyfriend, they approached the door and were asking, who is it? And there was, banging on the door, but there was no call of this is the police. And so that's the key thing. The case of Stephen Shrively of Topeka, Kansas, in like the 90s. That was just one case of these, this basically the same, course of events playing out. And that's very pivotal, because if the police did, in fact, not announce this is the police and identify themselves, it's my understanding, I'm not a lawyer, but it's my understanding from what I've been reading that in Kentucky, you do have the right, because of the Castle Doctrine and stand your ground, whatever it may be. And this is something I don't understand why gun rights activists aren't really jumping on this, hypocrisy, but it's, as far as my understanding, Kenneth Walker had the right to defend himself. Had he not known that was the police.
I got to be honest. I don't understand why he wouldn't. I mean, basically, you hear somebody banging on your door. You hear someone banging on your door. And when you hear the banging on your door, response is, okay, I don't know who that is. It sounds like they're trying to knock the door open. What do you do? I mean, you're in the United States. I mean, it's like the Second Amendment is this thing that's prized as if Jesus himself walked across the floor with it. And so you have somebody who defends their home. And then you find out after the fact that they're cops. And you are like, well, wait a minute. How would I know that you're cops? That's the logical thing, right? And if the people did say, we're cops, we're coming in, would the person really grab their gun? And I don't believe they would. So, it's like a household that clearly they didn't have drugs in the household. They weren't, like trying to hold back the night. It's like we're blazing guns coming out. None of that stuff is true. And so the catch becomes, well, if those cops really did come in and they announced themselves, why would this couple, who clearly weren't criminals, would have responded by getting a weapon? Logically, they wouldn't have. So I agree with you, Anthony, I agree with you 1,000%, that most likely, if they did announce, which I doubt, nobody heard them. In which case the cops come in blazing guns. But the problem is, again, you're still stuck with the same problem. If they shoot back, do the cops have a right to defend themselves and open up? I would say if they didn't announce themselves, no. The state is never going to say that. And so the state goes with the one witness and says, okay, we heard this person whisper cops. It's horrific. It honestly is. Which is why they probably gave the $12 million hoping, okay, we gave $12 million, nobody's going to burn stuff down because we gave $12 million. But the issue here is the law, the accountability from the standpoint of the cops. And, again, whether they announced or not, or whether it was this kind of quiet announcement, you have to really deal with this issue of the no-knock warrant and whether or not that should be legal, especially in America where people, Castle Doctrine in many of these places, and I think logically most people would say, well, yeah, people should have the right to defend themselves if they think somebody's trying to break into their household. So all of these things come into play, and none of these things entirely were resolved with the ending of this case. We have Ben in Ohio. Ben, what's going on?
Hey, how are you? I think that there's a certain irony to the case that a lot of people aren't talking about, which is if you look at the Second Amendment, the way it's written, in order to preserve the free state and all that stuff, a well-regulated militia. If you read it in its purest form, the way that Breonna Taylor's boyfriend or fiance responded was quite literally why it was made. Like, he was completely within the purview of that amendment, which is so fascinating. It's like you literally have like the state coming in. They didn't, whether they announced themselves or not, like it wasn't like they didn't have any purpose to really be there, and he, as a gun owner, acted accordingly. So I thought that was something that was interesting. But the reason why I knew the case wouldn't really go anywhere is, like, I watch like people like streaming and stuff like that, video games and stuff like that, and I've seen people get swatted before, and nothing happens. You know what I mean? Like the SWAT team, the sheriff or whomever, like, they don't get into trouble because they do that. So I was viewing it from that framework, and if you view it from that framework, there's really no. It's like the self-defense of yourself, according to the state, does not supersede the incompetence of the police officer in this case.
Exactly.
So they're never going to, because it sets a precedent, right? Because then in every other case that's happened, the families could open like a civil suit.
1,000%, Ben. You're so right. Like, think of the one in Salt Lake City. When I was in the hospital, I was watching TV, and I was telling my team, I was like, dude, you got to cover this. You got to cover this. I don't know if they did. But it was a kid in Salt Lake City, autistic. The mom calls for that kid, basically saying that, look, my kid is out of control. I need help. And I think she even gives a specific like medical terminology for it and everything else. The cops come. The kid is wilding out. The cops murder the kid. Now, the mom is horrified by this because she's watching them as they kill her kid. And she is like losing it, freaking out. Because again, this is a mom watching her kid who's ill, basically murdered by the cops. Now, she, at this point, was like, they could have tackled him, they could have tased him, they could have done all of these other ghastly things to stop this child, I think he was like 14 years old, from acting the way he was acting. It wasn't even like he had the physical mass to hurt the cop. Whether you see them shoot a dog, whether you see, the incompetence of the cop often doesn't supersede the right of the person to defend themselves. If that mom would have turned around and tried to kill that cop, they would have prosecuted that mom, despite the fact the mom would have been correct to try to defend her child from that maniac of a cop. And unfortunately, yeah, you're right, Ben. I mean, this is normal in the United States. I mean, you get 1,000 killings a year by cops. 1% get prosecuted. That's astonishing. And so this number of accountability comes into play of like, well, wait a minute, that's zero accountability. Or, I'm sorry, 1% accountability. You may have many of these cases where the cop is right, meaning the cop is defending themselves, and I have no issue with fair game in that case. But I'm sorry, in many of these cases, it is not fair game. The Breonna case was not a fair game case. And there needs to be questions about the procedures that take place. I mean, cops are like, oh my God, my life is in danger. Yeah, if you're doing a no-knock warrant, where you're basically not announcing who you are, or you're doing so quietly, or within a split second, cops, bam! As if the people are going to fully understand what's taking place within that split second, then yeah, your job is extremely dangerous. Because you are doing something that is putting your life in danger, and then putting it on the other person who has no way of knowing of what is happening in this situation, meaning the onus is on them, despite the fact that we're behaving incompetently, or we're behaving irrationally. Let's do this. Let's take a break. We have a guest coming up. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Ben, great point. We'll be back in a moment.
Fault Lines. We are above all the latest developments, and we don't take any sides. Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
So, Sean, what do you want to talk about today?
Well, Bob, that's easy. I want to talk about the need to stop the development of self-driving cars.
Again, Sean, you're driving me nuts. I think the self-driving car thing's already out of the gate.
No. It's never too late. See, now the leading experts in the field, just pick one, whichever one, leading experts have repeatedly warned us about the dangers of artificial intelligence. Look, I'm telling you, man, we have to stop the robots by any means necessary.
I see what you did there.
Yep.
Tune into our show By Any Means Necessary daily from 2 to 4 p.m. Eastern Time on Radio Sputnik. And don't forget to call in at 3:20 p.m. to our studio number 202-521-1320.
And if you miss us live, check us out on SputnikNews.com, Spreaker, iTunes, iHeartRadio, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts to stay up to date on the latest political, social, and economic movements shaping the world around us.
Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm here with my co-host Shane Stranahan. Joining us is Associate Professor of Economics at the University of Missouri, Kansas City, Dr. Linwood Taid. Welcome to the show, Dr. Taid. How's it going today?
It's going well, thank you.
So I wanted to have somebody on to talk about the economic numbers. Yesterday, we were just shy of 1 million people who filed again for unemployment. This does not seem to be abating. And again, the more people who we have filing for unemployment, the more people we have who basically don't have a job. There are going to be downward consequences of this, meaning from the standpoint of their purchasing power, what they can buy, where they typically spend their money, and the inability for them to have that money to spend, and the companies and the people who work at those companies that affect. But I wanted to bring somebody on who was competent about this stuff. Hence, you. What do these job numbers tell us? I mean, after all, this is what, the third, fourth, fifth week of having nearly 1 million people out of a job at this point?
Well, what it tells us is that the recovery is stalling. There was a downward trend in terms of the unemployment numbers for a couple of months, particularly due to the relief payments that was in the CARES Act. And of course, those payments have discontinued for the most part. Although there's still some people who applied for those funds as long as a month ago or so, and haven't received them yet. So the funds are still moving out into the economy, but not on a large basis. So over the past couple of weeks or so, the unemployment numbers have not fallen. And so we are at a plateau, if you will, I guess a trough. And what the expectation is that we will see those numbers go up again because the recovery has stalled.
And Dr. Linwood,
why
is the recovery stalled?
Oh, go ahead, Shane. I'm sorry.
Say that again, please.
I'm going to ask you, why do you think the recovery is stalled? What is the underlying process? What's the bottleneck here? What's not being done that could be done? There's different sides of this, but why is recovery stalled?
Well, the unemployment rate is projected at is estimated at about 8.4%. But that unemployment rate is calculated to include people who are looking for work and have not worked in the last 4 weeks, but are still actively looking for work. That actively looking for work means you have to go out and apply for jobs that are listed. But if you're reading a newspaper and there are no jobs that are listed, you're not likely to go out in a long fall off, in a long down economic situation. You're not likely to go to look for work, and so those workers we call discouraged workers. And the impact of discouraged workers on the economy is much greater when the economy is worse because you have a larger number of discouraged workers. And so the number that's reported, which is called the U3 number, is at 8.4%. But if we included those workers who are discouraged, we're likely to be at about twice that amount. And you get an idea of what that amount should be because there are about 26 million Americans who are receiving some kind of unemployment insurance, meaning they are completely not working. They're not working, or they're working at such so few hours that they still will qualify for assistance. And if we look at that number in terms of the labor force, which is about 165 million people who would be available for work, that gets us to about 15.7, about 16%. And so it's twice the number that's being reported as the unemployment, the U3 numbers. And so, we have more and more workers who are just not looking for work because there are no jobs out there, and they're not able to spend money into the economy to prime the economy because relief funding has been discontinued.
Can you give us the consequences of this? Like, not entirely from the standpoint of people being able to spend cash, but from your profession, from the economics profession, when it's looking out and seeing negative externalities of people not necessarily having just the basic resources, or not even having a job, or even from the standpoint of their own self, like depression and those type of things, and the repercussions of even that. What are the negative outcomes for this in regards to not just our economy, but our world, of these people basically being in this particular situation?
Yeah, I mean, we're seeing an increase in folks who are standing in food lines, and we're reaching a level of food line support or necessity that is certainly reminding us of the Great Depression. Now, the Great Depression, the highest unemployment rate in the Great Depression was officially 25%. But that was in 1933, so it took 3 years to get there. During this particular pandemic and the resulting economic consequences, the unemployment rate went up to an official 20% in about 3 months. And so what took us to a low in terms of employment in the Great Depression took 3 months here. And so people are out of work. They're standing in food lines. And they are also looking at, although there's a moratorium on evictions for the most part until January, they don't have the money to pay that back rent and won't have it in January because they're not working. And so what's going to happen, of course, in January when that moratorium is lifted is that all of the filings that are being sent to the courts right now are going to start moving through the courts, and people are going to start being evicted. And if you don't have income, but you have a mortgage to pay or rent to pay, even though you don't have to pay it now, you are under a tremendous amount of stress. And so we're finding, for example, that suicides are increasing. And so there are just ripple effects through the society that are connected to this economic distress. And particularly as the Republicans and the Democrats, the law system, the representatives are not agreeing on another support package, and so people are in desperation for this.
Dr. Tauheed, could you please just give us a brief bit of history here on the way that the measurements of the labor force participation rate, the measurements of unemployment, changed back in the early 90s? I believe it was in 1990, but I might be getting the date wrong there. I'm sure you know about this. Could you just get into that a little bit?
Well, when we're saying the change in the way the unemployment rate has been calculated, the unemployment rate has been calculated pretty much in a consistent way since the 1940s, when during the Great Depression, when it was a need to figure out more accurately what that unemployment rate is. But understand, the unemployment rate, people usually think that the unemployment rate is connected to the number of people who are collecting unemployment insurance. And but there are many who are unemployed and are not looking for work. And in most states, in order to collect unemployment insurance, you have to be actively looking for work. And so, for example, if you've been unemployed, receiving unemployment insurance for 26 weeks, generally you are now no longer eligible. And so the unemployment insurance number is not the unemployment rate number. The unemployment rate number actually undercounts those who are unemployed, but no longer looking for work, either because they've run out of unemployment insurance, and therefore their requirement to look for work, but they haven't found work. Excuse me, they haven't found work in half a year, and have very little prospects of getting that work. And so it's important to understand that the unemployment number always undercounts the number of people who are actually unemployed. That number is a politically defined number. It's not a number that I guess economists would look at. It's not the only number that economists would look at. And so the U6 number, which includes discouraged worker, is now a much more accurate measure of those persons who are unemployed. And as I said before, if we count those, that'll be about 16%, which is again about twice the number that's reported. The administration is always going to report the best number, and the best number would be the lowest. In this case, is the U3.
Can we also get into this connection between poverty and unemployment? Meaning, not poverty, I'm sorry, crime and poverty. And, poverty, of course, is going to go in line with unemployment. If you don't have a job, if you don't have ends, that's going to put you in a situation where you don't have the funding to get from point A to point B or to buy and pay for your expenses. How does crime factor into this number, even for that matter, crime and violence? And I'm talking about those as separate things, but how do these two numbers factor into a worsening unemployment situation?
Well, let's talk about violence, because we think of violence generally in terms of, for example, criminals who are engaging in robbery or burglary. Well, robbery in this case. But when economic times are hard, when families are under stress, we find that there's an increase in domestic violence. And so families begin to feel the strain, and there is an increase in violence within the family because the family has less income that it needs actually to stay coherent. But there is, in many studies, there is a very, very strong positive correlation with the economic conditions of a community and the crime rate in that community, particularly with things like petty thefts or robberies. People are going to, if they need to support their families and themselves, and they can't do it legally, they're going to, they're then incentivized or forced to find any means of supplying that income that they need. And so, we start out perhaps with petty crimes, with robbery and burglary, but those crime rates are going to go up in harsh economic situations. We certainly saw that during the Great Depression. We saw that during the Great Recession of the 2008 period, that the crime rate has gone up. Now, it goes up relative to where it was, so we're in a fairly low level of crime now relative to prior periods, but the rate is going up. Suicides and homicides are going up, and domestic violence is going up. So the crime rate is very much affected by people's ability to support themselves financially.
You've been listening to Associate Professor of Economics in University of Missouri, Kansas City, Dr. Linwood Tauheed. Let's take a break. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We'll be back in a moment.
Fault Lines.
Radio Sputnik.
What's the most important hour of the day? It's the Critical Hour with Dr. Wilmer Leon. On this show, we don't just deliver the latest headlines. We divide the real from the fake. Tune in to hear from some of the most brilliant political minds of today, get in-depth news and analysis that goes beyond the surface and dig straight into the details. Set your clock to the Critical Hour for a news perspective unlike any of those other guys. Tune in to the Critical Hour with Dr. Wilmer Leon, weekdays 6 to 7 p.m. Eastern, and catch us on Facebook Live. You're listening to Radio Sputnik.
Fault Lines.
And We're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan and Dr. Linwood Tauheed, Associate Professor of Economics at the University of Missouri, Kansas City. Dr. Tauheed, thank you again for being with us. We were talking earlier about how poverty produces crime. There's also another side of it, of course. Crime can produce poverty. Then there's this deeper conversation about, economic opportunities in the place. If you would have crime, if there were economic opportunities, I don't know, that's a much more complicated conversation. Another side of this, actually, I don't want to get too deep into it, it's just the origins of the mafia, where if you look in different places at different times, different criminal cartels, mafia organizations or literally drug cartels, whatever the form those cartels are going to take. Those are formed where you have, as far as I can tell, a weakness in a state. You don't have law and order introduced by the state for whatever reason. That law and order has broken down or it wasn't created. And so instead you have sort of para-state organizations coming in. That's a bit of an aside. I'm curious, though, from your perspective as an economist, does that apply just briefly? I just sort of want to do a sort of reality check on that. Is that relevant or true, Dr. Tauheed?
Well, I think it's obviously a complex situation, but the way that economists typically want to look at these things is looking at what we call the supply side and the demand side for the particular phenomenon. And so, if we're talking about drug cartels, where ingredients for drugs like coca plants or other times of heroin poppies. Those are, of course, as you mentioned, grown successfully in states in which there is a limited law enforcement. But persons who are in those states, in those countries that are suppliers of those materials, of those substances, have to also have a demand on the other side. And so, for example, the increase in drug use in the United States creates an incentive for persons who are in poor countries who may have no other means of supporting themselves to supply heroin and cocaine ingredients. And so there's a supply side problem and there's a demand side problem. Now, the supply side problem is a result of the poverty of the population. That is, this is the only way they can support themselves, and therefore they instead of farming vegetables, they're farming coca plants and poppies. But there's also going to be a demand on the other side. And so, for example, we have studies that are fairly recent and ongoing about the increase in the use of legal drugs, fentanyl and OxyContin, and other kinds of drugs that are used for medication, and people are using those more and more as their economic situation becomes desperate. And so we find, for example, that the demand in the United States for these kinds of narcotic for drugs is increasing as the economy gets worse. And therefore, there's going to be an incentive for those who are supplying to supply those drugs. It's not just a matter of bad people using drugs or bad people producing drugs. This is their economic incentives to supply, and then there are economic pressures that will increase demand. And those are both, at least from an economics point of view, connected to the economic conditions of the suppliers and the demanders.
I'm so glad you said that. I've often made the argument that ethics, morality, those things are emergent, or what we would consider to be ethics, morality, are emergent qualities, and that there will be this kind of level of ethics going all the way down into even things like, Roman slavery, where there's a way of doing it that is ethical versus not. Can you talk about that for a moment? Because I often make the point that if our world was less harsh, like if it was less impoverished, then you would also almost by definition have less violence, less chaos, less crime, et cetera, et cetera. And crime being this kind of, this governmental thing. So fair point. But can you speak about that?
Yeah.
I mean, am I wrong? Am I right in that? That basically hostilities or difficulties create that much more of a hostile world?
Well, I actually think it's pretty intuitively obvious that when people are in desperate financial situations, they will engage in whatever activities they need to engage in to get the economic support that they need. And there may be a proportion of the population who are sociopathic or psychopathic and engage in violent and criminal and immoral activity anyway. But I don't think the general public, I don't think people in general are just criminal by nature. It's the circumstances that creates the reasons, the incentives to engage in, quote, illegal activity. I mean, look, if drugs were legalized, then none of that would be an issue in terms of legality, but people would still have to earn a living and they'd still have to engage in those same practices. And so when people are in desperate situations, they will do whatever they need to do in order to support themselves and their families. So yes, it is in that sense situational, and much of the poverty that we find, for example, in Latin America and South America, former Asian colonies of European countries, is poverty that comes from those former colonial situations, or from recent from recent violence that's occurring in those countries that not only incentivize people to engage in production of drug producing plants, but also to migrate from those countries to places in which they hope will be less violent. And so I would contend that people would want to stay in their own countries if they can make a living and support their families. But people migrate for economic reasons. There's a push and a pull. If there's violence going on in the country, people are pushed to migrate. And if they can earn a better living somewhere else, they are pulled to migrate. And so that's a supply and demand situation as well.
Dr. Tauhid, could we I just want to go back for a second. Economists will often use the term supply side and demand side, these two sort of hemispheres of economic thought. Could you please just give a brief breakdown of what those two terms mean, maybe with a few examples?
Well, when I say supply and demand, I'm talking about a unified system where there are suppliers of things and therefore there are customers who will demand those. And that creates a system of what we call exchange, buying and selling. Now, when we talk about supply side economics or demand side economics, we're talking about an emphasis on the supply side or an emphasis on the demand side. So, for example, supply side economics would argue that if there's not enough employment in a community, in a country, that incentives should go to the companies that will hire those employees. In other words, to those who are the profit earners in that situation. And then they will use that money to increase the supply of goods and services by employing people. Now, that ignores the fact that you have to have demand on the other side. And if you just emphasize demand, then you can increase demand, for example, by just pushing money out into the economy. But if there's no increase in supply, what you get is inflation. And so in either of those situations, you have to have a balance of supply and demand. So supply side emphasis and demand side emphasis are emphasizing just one of those things. But you have to have a balance, and so you can't have increased supply beyond demand, or have an increase in demand beyond supply without having detrimental consequences economically. And so both of those are, I think, exaggerations of what a supply and demand analysis would lead to. And they become in many cases ideological, and therefore politically polarizing, in the sense that conservatives or Republicans are usually associated with the supply side idea. Send money to the job creators is the model they use. And Democrats are usually associated with the demand creators, just push money out into the economy. And both of those may be right in some cases, but we have to be wiser about when we do that so that we don't cause detrimental economic consequences for the community at large.
Dr. Tauheed, thank you for that great breakdown. I just wanted to follow up with this real quick. Interestingly enough, we had another economist on, economics professor Mark Frost yesterday. He bills himself as a recovering libertarian, a Schumpeterian. Anyway, he was actually, for a recovering libertarian. This might be a little bit surprising. He was actually arguing for a demand side shock. He was arguing for an infusion of money, something like a basic income, where I don't want to get this too wrong, but I think he said $10,000 to everybody earning under $50,000 a year. And then it sort of peters out up to $100,000. Now, the point that he made was people shouldn't save that. They should spend it. If you save the money, then it doesn't help the problem. You have a savings glut. Could you just get briefly into the savings aspect of this and how that would tie into both a demand and a supply approach to solving recession?
Yes. Well, I agree with his general analysis that in this situation, we need an increase in demand because people are unemployed, they've lost their jobs, and they've lost their ability to support their families. But it does make a difference as to who the supply, the relief, for example, would go to. If you send it to people who are going to spend it, then that money will continue to circulate through the economy. If you send it to those who are in financially good shape, they're not likely to simply spend more money because they have it. They're going to increase their wealth and they're going to save it. So money just flows out of government funding into private bank accounts. And that's where it stays. It stops there. There's no increase in demand in the economy. And so there's no reason for that kind of spending to actually improve the employment situations of people because there won't be any increase in demand, just an increase in savings. And so, we've learned that this happens not just with ordinary people, but it happens with businesses who receive, for example, tax breaks. With the idea that if we lower the taxes on business, they're going to invest, that is, buy new plant and equipment, which will increase employment in the country. And we find that instead of buying new plant and equipment, they simply use it to buy back stocks and increase the value of their stock holdings, which has no effect on the real economy because that doesn't produce a job. Not one job.
It's just shoring up corporate profits and specifically increasing the value of corporate stocks, as far as I can tell, making more profits for the investor class. Great conversation. Dr. Linwood Tauheed, thank you so much for joining us.
It's been a pleasure.
For those listening, that was Dr. Linwood Tauheed, Associate Professor of Economics at the University of Missouri, Kansas City. You've been listening to Fault Lines with Jamarl Thomas and Shane Stranahan. We'll be back in a minute with headlines. Be right back.
Listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Fault lines.
And we're back live, coming to you from across the divided states of America in the politically independent corner, floating somewhere in an outer ring of our orbit. I am your political analyst, Shane Stranahan.
And in the left corner, I am the indefatigable, ever vigilant, the last man on the wall, your political analyst, Jamarl Thomas.
And together, across the galaxy, we are Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. All right. As we're going to get into the headlines. We do this once at 7, once at 8, and once at 9 a.m. Eastern for those on the West Coast, as I formerly was just a couple weeks ago. That's at 4, 5, and 6 a.m. Pacific, although God forbid those who get up that early to listen to us. If you do, props to you. But without further ado, let's get into headlines. First up, President Trump signed an executive order he calls his vision for healthcare yesterday. He spoke about it from an aircraft hangar in North Carolina, saying the plan, quote, extends affordable insurance options, reduces the cost of prescription drugs, will end surprise medical billing, increases fairness through price transparency, streamlines bureaucracy, accelerates innovation, strongly protects Medicare, and always protects patients with pre-existing conditions, end quote. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi retaliated, saying that, quote, President's been in office for nearly 4 years. He keeps talking about supporting pre-existing conditions. He hasn't done anything about it. We have very much been willing to work with him, end quote. She, of course, speaking on behalf of the Democrats there with that royal we. Critics say the president's executive order will not bear the weight of a law. Protests continued in Louisville, Kentucky, where protesters there are continuously angry, as I see they have valid reason for being, that no homicide charges have been filed in the killing of Breonna Taylor. She was a 26-year-old emergency medical technician, former EMT, who was shot by police in March. The late Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg will lie in state in the Capitol building today. She is the first woman and the first Jewish American to lie in state there. Ginsburg will be buried at Arlington National Cemetery on Tuesday, this coming Tuesday. A federal court in California is halting the Trump administration's plan to stop counting for the 2020 census early this year, ordering that the census continue for another month. The Justice Department has said it will appeal that decision. Results from the U.S. Census delivered by the Constitution are used to measure political participation and disburse federal funding for the next decade. That federal funding, of course, going to states based on the results of their census. Facebook and Twitter say they've removed several hundred Russian-backed accounts. Specifically, Facebook's head of security policy said that while these accounts did not focus on the U.S. And had gained little following and had not directly targeted the 2020 election, that, quote, they are linked to actors associated with election interference in the U.S. in the past, end quote. Specifically, the leak of hacked emails from the Democratic National Committee and Hillary Clinton's campaign 4 years ago. The networks reportedly mainly focused on Syria, Ukraine, Turkey, and Belarus. By the way, I just want to point out those are some of our objects of focus, too. It feels good to be in such wonderful company. It's also interesting to see social media networks doing the bidding of the monolithic U.S. government, trying to shut down apparently all forms of suppression, of dissent, and, effectively, in a weird way, pushing back on Julian Assange. Again, if these accounts were linked to people they're saying that were involved in the release of emails from the DNC and Hillary Clinton's campaign 4 years ago, emails which, by the way, revealed a bunch of nasty stuff, including that the DNC had pushed Bernie out during the 2016 election. Well, I don't know. I can't help but feel like that's actual journalism and that Facebook and Twitter are just suppressing journalism by doing this. Having said that, I work for a Russian government-backed outlet, but it's also my genuinely held conviction. I'm just swatting the flies away preemptively by putting that disclaimer out there. Breaking news from this morning. At least 4 have been injured in France as a man wielding a machete went on a stabbing spree near Charlie Hebdo's former HQ. Charlie Hebdo is a French magazine which drew both international criticism and international support for its depiction of Muhammad on its front page back in 2006 and subsequently its new depiction of Muhammad in 2012. This came before its headquarters were attacked by Islamist gunmen in 2015, killing 12 staff members. If you remember, this was shortly after followed by the Je suis Charlie, Charlie hashtag, sort of worldwide thing that happened there. Anyway, that was then. On September 1st of this year, the magazine republished the cartoons. That came ahead of a trial which is ongoing against the suspected gunman in that 2015 attack. And then again, this morning, another attack took place. At least 4 have been injured, and the suspect reportedly is in custody. Next headline, North Korea's leader, Kim Jong-un, has issued an apology after his troops shot and killed a South Korean fisheries official. It was thought that official had been trying to defect. Jong-un said he was, quote, greatly sorry, end quote, for the, quote, unsavory incident in our waters, end quote. Farmers across India are blocking roads and railways in protest of farm bills, which they say would dismantle the minimum support price system in the country, leaving them at the mercy of large corporations. The main roads around Delhi are blocked, as well as those around Bangalore, with farmers rallying with tractors and water buffalo. Those are our headlines. That's the news. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. and we're back into it. And I suppose we are also taking calls. 202-521-1320 again, 202-521-1320. Yeah, man, I my mind keeps going back to the Facebook and Twitter thing. We talked about it last hour. We don't need to talk about it again now, but it just does rankle me. It draws my ire that they're doing us. Partly, I'll admit there's a bit of self-interest here. I'm worried that they're going to come after me. I'm worried that they're going to come after us and try to shut us down because, apparently criticizing the U.S. state is now increasingly disallowed by the U.S. state, formerly known as a bastion of free speech around the world. But hey, how the time flies. I don't know. What's your take, Jamarl?
Well, it's the bastion of free speech as long as that speech is not being used to impugn the character of that of that nation. It's like anything else, right? Look, for all the lofty ideas, whatever those lofty ideas are, they are subordinate to the pressures to the people who have to fulfill those ideas. Meaning, if we are running in a presidential race, you and I have a lead in that race, it may be in my best interest to not have a debate with you, even though the debate is in the best interest of the people in the country itself who are in that democratic order. I hope you understand what I mean. I'm saying the pressures of the position itself kind of make people do things that may be against the philosophical interests of the position. So when we're looking at Facebook and they say, hey, we are giving out all of this information and this kind of democratic order and representative government and et cetera, et cetera. And then the people in that government say, hey, you can help get Trump elected. We don't like that. Republicans and Democrats. Now, that's the interesting part, because there are a lot of Republicans that don't really like Trump all that much, even though they would say, yeah, we like Trump. And what do? They bring social media into government and they browbeat them. How dare you do this? How dare you allow this information to be critical of the United States, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And if you're a social media, you're a private institution, what are you thinking when you go back home? You're thinking, those guys can shut us down. Not just shut us down. Those guys can make it difficult for us to operate. Those guys can bring up certain lawsuits that impugn our company, that make it difficult for us to do business. And between falling in line and not, it's easier to fall in line. And so you have a social media company like Twitter or Facebook who may get rid of Palestinian sites. You may have them getting rid of Press TV, which is an Iranian site, or Telesur, which is a Venezuelan site. And you think to yourself, wait a minute, is there any weirdness associated with the fact that these companies, Twitter, Facebook, etc., mind you, this is in the context of Donald Trump screaming at the height of his lungs and the United States screaming about Huawei and back channels in Huawei, or for that matter, TikTok, saying that these are Asian companies that are doing something nefarious in America, while simultaneously having Facebook and Twitter get rid of Press TV or Telesur or some of these Palestinian sites that it doesn't like that seem to be contrary to the interests of the U.S. government. Isn't that weird? Like, I'm always amazed at the level of hypocrisy that can be displayed within the context of one very specific time frame, and people can look at one and they'll pay no attention to the other. TikTok is horrible, but Twitter is getting rid of Press TV. What doesn't it like that Press TV is saying? Is it that they may take an interest that is in the purview of their state, kind of like Twitter is taking an interest in the purview of its own state? Yeah, Shane, they're like, from a free speech standpoint, I think the problem and the contradiction is that the world has become integrated, meaning from the standpoint of technology and from the standpoint of communication. I can see what's happening in those other countries, and I can take a perspective of it, whether I like it or dislike it. And you could see it all around the world, including in the United States. So when you have protesters getting their head bashed in, and companies or countries around the world, even countries that are friendly to us, that are shocked by this, that are gassed by this, you can see it in an instant. Just like I can see something that happens in, let's say, Iran, and I can say, I don't like it. Or I can see something that the United States is doing in Iran and say, I don't like it. Well, that's a more integrated world. And maybe these tech companies should have thought about that before wiring up the world like this. And maybe the governments should have thought about that before allowing the tech companies to do such a thing. But however it happened, it's happened. And our question is, what does it mean in regards to our time, meaning now? Because this is the first time in the world that has ever been this way. Yeah, you might have had newspapers, and you might have had something like in Germany where you have radio and so forth. But even this is another order of magnitude different. And we need to deal with it. And it's just something as a society we have to deal with. And yeah, I get that people don't like it. I get that governments, chafe at it. I get that tech companies don't necessarily have negotiated it within the context of the capitalistic space and the governmental space. And yet, here we are. This is our world. It's never been all that simplistic. There's always been a level of complication associated with it. And this is just where we are. It's like, it's not that it's great, but it's not that it's horrible either. There are aspects of it that's horrible. There are aspects of it that's great. I, for one, considering my perch and where we are in regards to the media space, I like the fact that we have that ability to look around the world and make assessments, yay or nay. Even if our assessments are right, even if our assessments are wrong, we have the potential and the capability of doing it. So on that part, I do think it's good. On the other part, in the way that governments are reacting to it, in the way private enterprise, to some degree, are even reacting to the way governments are pushing on them, that just means that we need something else that goes beyond this notion of our free space or private space or our ability to communicate, being within specific contexts of a private enterprise. Maybe there needs to be something more. And I got to be honest, I'm not entirely sure what that more is. Any ideas?
Maybe, but I mean, here's the thing: is that as far as I can tell, the pushback is coming from the government in this case. Did I ever tell you about the investor whose comments I heard in the Bay Area? Do you remember this? I think we might have talked about it. Probably not. Maybe not.
I don't think you have.
I was out in the Bay Area.
That I'm aware of.
Yeah, so I was out in the Bay Area doing like existential risk research, briefly working, not a paid position, but it was cool stuff. It was just a little bit heady and overwhelming, like far future research on the threat of like a nuclear war or an asteroid hitting. The thing we were actually most worried about at the time was rogue AI, like some sort of, recursively improving, self-stimulating, self-guiding AI that's acting according to its own ethics and definitely not according to ours. So we were worried about stuff like that. Admittedly, a little bit far afield in some sense. Anyway, I was out there doing this stuff. One night, I was at this soiree and just a party. another way to put it. I was at this party, and people were going around, and there were investors or whatever. There were just people, writers, different people. And I remember a woman who was a head of an AI investment company, like doing early stage research and R&D and investment in AI and stuff. And what she was talking about was Twitter, Facebook, specifically those two companies, getting pushback from the government, and how the efforts to sort of shut down on free speech, I think this was back in late 2016, maybe 2017, the efforts to try to get them to stop talking, all of this was happening with the idea that if they don't do it, the government will come after them with an antitrust suit. Because, especially if you look at Facebook, they've grown, they're big, they now own Oculus, like it's not exactly a monopoly, but maybe in some sense, the government could make that case. The point here is, it's not, as far as I can tell, that the companies are trying to push this stuff. Sure, there are certain employees in the companies that are amenable to it. It's more so that the government, specifically certain agents within the government, are more than willing to threaten the hammer if these companies don't do what they want. Anyway, we've got to go into a break. Jamarl, I'll let you bring us back on the other side to get your response. And we're also taking calls, 202-521-1320. You're listening to Fault Lines with Jamarl Thomas and Shane Stranahan. We'll be right back.
Fault Lines. 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. We give you the most essential information out there. Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
Are you bored? Are you lonely? Do you need a hug? Well, we can't give you that, but we can keep you up to date on Radio Sputnik.
We are talking
24 hours a day, 7 days a week.
You are listening.
We give you the most essential out of the endless information space.
Radio Sputnik, telling the untold. Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm joined by my co-host, Shane Stranahan. We're coming to you live out of our station in D.C. If you guys live in the area, you can catch us on the radio at 105.5 FM and 1390 AM. We're also in Kansas City at 102.9 FM and 104.7 FM. Also, if you guys are digging what Shane and I are putting down, whatever platform you're consuming us on, give us a like and share that content. If you want to join in on the conversation, you can send us a chat, a tweet, and of course, you can reach us by phone at 202-521-1320. That is 202-521-1320. Your engagement makes this show what it is, so definitely feel free to call or give us a chat. Don't be afraid to do so. I rarely bite. Shane rarely bites. But definitely feel free to call in. There's a ceremony for Ruth Bader Ginsburg going on right now at the Capitol building. Apparently that's supposed to be starting in 15 minutes. You know, one of the things I like to say, or I like to point out, is that oftentimes it is the error that gives more information in regards to what's going on. Like, and this is a software thing. If you're looking for a bug, if you're looking for something that blows up in your system, looking for the thing that doesn't make sense is usually giving you more context to the way your system actually works. Well, same thing with this. We are supposed to have a judiciary that is not supposed to be political. It's supposed to be there just looking at the law and is presenting the law as if the law is an absolute and a flat fact thing. The reality of it is, anything that you put down in word is often interpreted because language in and of itself is imprecise in getting something across. You have this often, even in the conversations that Shane and I have, when it would be, well, what is the definition of the definition? Those type of conversations, meaning what does this word really mean? And you're pulling the word apart to try to get to some crux, because at the end of the day, we speak in words, and oftentimes we have those words with double meanings, even precisely, specifically in law. There's some things in law that you want to be a fudge. I hope you understand what I mean. Like when you're looking at British law and British conversation, they would call it a fudge. And it would just be something that means something, but may not exactly mean what you think it means, but put there because we can't really come to an agreement. Like let's say you and I are having a conversation about something. We need to get this agreement done. We can't really come to this agreement because, frankly, we disagree. But the agreement needs to take place. You could put a fudge in. That fudge can be there for people to argue about later on for courts and everything else. But ultimately, it was put there, not because it was specific, but because it wasn't. I'm making the point that our judiciary is doing something similar. When they're looking at the law, they're pulling the law apart, and they're trying to come to some conclusion about what it means. But what it means is determined upon the person who's looking at it, and that person's biases and their ideas. And by the way, even sometimes what it means doesn't even matter. The person's biases come into play more than anything else. That is your court system. That is your Supreme Court. Yes, the court wants to keep this appearance, especially Judge Roberts, that we are above politics, which is the reason why Obamacare went through the way it went through. If you remember, Obamacare, believe it or not, was supposed to at least be struck down or very close to struck down. Scalia was petitioning Roberts, going all the way up until the point where the ruling was given. Roberts did not want the President of the United States, the first black president, to have his main policy objective struck down by the Supreme Court. And so they did. Now, they did other things, meaning around the edges, but at the end of the day, Obamacare was upheld. They did not want the Supreme Court to be considered a political instrument. That was something that Roberts cared about, despite the fact that he was more of a right-wing judge. Well, what about now? Are you going to be able to get that perspective now? And the answer, of course, is going to be no. Donald Trump is not going to put in an RBG. He may put in a woman of color. He could even go so far as to put in a Jewish woman to represent the interests of, meaning I'm going to put in somebody who's just her age, who's just like RBG, but she's going to be hard to the right. He's not going to do that. He's probably going to put in a woman of color that is also going to be hard to the right. This notion of the court being impartial was never there, or at the very least it wasn't there in my lifetime. It wasn't there when it put George Bush in office, and it's not going to be there going forward. Let's be honest about it. Shane, do you have anything to say about that?
By the way, Jamarl,
go to the caller?
Yeah, totally. We should totally go to the caller, but real quick on this. This is going to be a deal next week. Did you see the bill that reportedly Democrats in the House are going to be putting forward next week, which would introduce term limits for the Supreme Court?
Good. They should have. I mean, look, let's stop pretending that the Supreme Court is not a political instrument. It is. They wouldn't fight so hard if it wasn't. And, it's like if your name is, for example, if your name is Bernie Sanders, if it's me, if I'm running and I become president of the United States, what am I going to do? I need to deal with the Supreme Court. I have to, because anything that I put up at that point can be struck down. Now, the Democrats' problem is they pretended for all of this time that the Supreme Court was not a political instrument. Well, with RBG passing, that's out the window. And so what do? You have to do something, right? I mean, I'm asking you, Shane, what do you do at this point? Like, if you're a lefty, if you're a Democrat, if you're somebody who doesn't trust that right-wing Supreme Court, what do? Don't you have to do something in your political power that puts limits and constraints on a Supreme Court that you no longer believe is impartial?
Let's talk about it. I want to make sure we get to our calls. We're taking calls 202-521-1320. I will definitely remember my take on this. But for now, we've got Jeff calling in from Kansas City. Jeff, you're on. What's going on?
Hey, good morning, gentlemen. I think sometimes we forget the origin of words and what the true meaning comes from. Like government. You guys talking about government a lot. And so again, history repeats itself. We know that govern means control, and meant sort of like means mind, and the origin of the word. And we forget words like governor and mayors, what they really mean. I mean, the origin of these words. So we need to understand that the United States was founded upon these, I want to say ancient words, and the true meaning of what they really mean. They didn't flip it because it got to America. We just never really was taught that in the history books. But if you look at the origin of these words, it's just playing out now. And I just want to say that's been this way for a while now. And I'm not trying to beat a dead horse by being a minority, but I want you to really consider what I'm saying. A lot of times people think, well, people just whining and all this and all that. But governments and people in power do test runs on lower subjects. That's the history of the world. And so in America, they've done it on minorities, whether it's blacks, whether it's Indians, just like they did, like Bill Gates trying to get the vaccine pushed in Jamaica to do experiment runs on people. And I think America didn't care enough about the lower class perceived people when the government was doing experiments, because they never thought it would happen to them. But now we're starting to see what people of my color always felt about the government. We always thought it was evil. We never got a fair shook. We always thought there was always something diabolical behind it because it wasn't fair. The court system was never equal unless you had the money. So what I'm saying is that myself, I'm not surprised. I'm just shocked that a lot of people are surprised. Oh my gosh, I can't believe what the government has done. But they always done that. And I kind of want you guys at least to respond a little bit to that. I know you don't quite understand it and you couldn't, but there's some truth there. And just thank you very much. I appreciate you guys' our show here.
Hey, thank you for the call, Jeff. Thank you for the call. One quick note. I believe you said a word you were not supposed to say, the S word, 4-letter word.
I think he was trying to say fair shake.
That, but
yeah, I think you just misspoke.
Okay.
Yeah,
okay.
He was trying to say fair shake.
Okay, there we go.
Just in context, he said we never got a fair shake, and it just kind of came out that way. But I'm going to respond. But my grandfather one day, my grandfather was, as he got older, like I said, he was a horrible person, but he was trying to say what he said, a shave and a something, but it came out really bad with the two S words. It happens. Look, Jeff, I agree that African Americans had a perspective of government, but why wouldn't we? You know what I mean? Like, of course we're going to have a certain perspective of government. If you're coming up and you have any knowledge of the 60s and the 50s and the 80s and the 1800s, et cetera, yeah, you're going to have a perspective of government that are formed by that. And I think, like, for example, during the civil rights movements in the 60s, whites didn't think there was an issue with civil rights. Blacks did. And even when we were looking at Dr. King, many of us thought, why is Dr. King talking about this stuff abroad? He needs to stay with this black stuff. Missing that there was, a connection between how people are treated abroad and how the U.S., the perspective of people abroad, and how they perceive African Americans and how we're treated here. So Jeff, I don't, I can't say I entirely think you're wrong. I do think there's a class thing that comes about where it becomes, poor whites are treated in similar ways. I mean, when we think about the civil rights, we're talking about the 1600 thing that the New York Times was doing. What, one in X number of whites had slaves? It was very few. I think it was less than 20%, if it was that much. And yet you had a lot of whites who was fighting for the South. Basically, you had dirt poor whites who was fighting for something that they didn't take a part of. Like, even though they might have had this thought of, like, you get land and you get this other stuff, but those people had to be cajoled into it because, again, they weren't necessarily taking the benefits of what they were fighting for. So, no, Jeff, I think it's a fair point. I don't think you're wrong. Shane, how do you perceive what he said? Because, you know, it's a biased way of looking at it in a way just because it's looking at it from my point of view, and so I can kind of see Jeff what's he's saying a little bit easier. But how do you perceive it? And then we can get back to the court issue, because I do want you to talk about the court and how you perceive the going after the court.
Well, we do have another caller. I mean, very briefly, if you're going to criticize, you know, I like that. I like the idea of going down to the roots of things, and sometimes the roots of words can be very instructive. And if you're going to indict government as a whole, you know, governments have always been oppressive, but what is the alternative to government? The alternative to government historically has been something like anarchy, I guess. You know, that's usually now a pejorative, and many people would say for good reason. I'm not so sure that I agree, but I mean, there are a couple different levels you can look at this on. Is it evolutionarily advantageous? In other words, mechanically, will it make sense for the people in that society to disband their state, or are they just going to get quickly overrun by another state? What does a worldwide anarchist state look like? Isn't that just a contradiction in terms? But isn't that what you'd need? I mean, this is a hornet's nest that we definitely do not have time for.
Okay, wait. Does it have to be anarchy? I mean, is it an alternative to? I know what you mean, because you're basically making the point that, look, any organization of people to some degree would just be a government. Like any organization. Like even if you say it's loosely aligned, even when you make your arguments about, hey, it needs to be more local, well, that's still government, any way you put it. So that's a fair point. I think his thing is the words are more controlling than what people believe they are, if that makes sense. Like if you're saying, you know, the government is a controlling edifice, well, yeah, it is. And do the words have meaning that go beyond? God, that's a hornet's nest. You're right. That's fair. Let's
just go straight to Robert from Kansas. Yeah. We're on. Robert, you're on. What's going on?
Hey, good morning, Fault Lines. Thanks for the call. This isn't the normal political call I'm making, but earlier you guys brought up the moon landing or moon landings. And I'm thinking that you guys believe that those were legitimate and went about as reported at the time. I'm a millennial. I'm a little bit younger, so I couldn't see any of that. But when I started looking into this thing, just as one point about it, and I'll let you guys come back. I mean, that was 1969. So we're talking 5 decades ago. And there's nothing up there, guys. I don't know if you own a telescope, but there's literally nothing up there. There's not they say there's reflectors and whatnot, but after 5 decades, in my opinion, there would be a military base, there would be a mine operation, or at this point, even like tourism, like hotels and stuff. So I'm a little bit too optimistic. I question the whole narrative. So I was just curious what you guys think about that outlook.
I mean, if that's where you're coming from, I also see nothing up on the moon, but I would just say that's because our society has been stagnant and has had the wrong focus for 50 plus years. I mean, 1969, call it around 50 years there. That's arguably a lot of stuff changed in the late 60s, early 70s in terms of the nature of the American economy, the global economy. We've talked about the change in the nature of the currency, the U.S. dollar, the Nixon shock. There are different sides of this, and I don't mean to beat a dead horse. That's my pet peeve, or that's my issue, so I keep bringing that up. But regardless, Robert, thank you for the call. We're going to go into a break right now. We'll be back on the other side with Lee Stranahan talking about Hunter Biden's ties to Ukraine. You're listening to Fault Lines with Jamarl Thomas and Shane Stranahan. We'll be right back.
Fault Lines. Tough questions are the most powerful weapon we have. As long as you have questions, we'll keep asking. Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Feeling kind of blue, but maybe also kind of red, and kind of purple, and kind of alone? You've got a friend on Radio Sputnik. Tune into Political Misfits from 12 to 2 Eastern Time, Monday through Friday, for news, politics, and culture without the two-party bias. Catch us daily on 105.5 in Washington, D.C., or 102.9 or 104.7 in Kansas City. Or find us on Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, Spotify, or wherever you get your news.
Fault lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Jamarl Thomas and Shane Stranahan and Lee Stranahan. That's my dad, Sputnik news analyst and host of The Backstory, airing Monday through Friday on Radio Sputnik from 4 to 6 p.m. Eastern. By the way, you can follow Lee on Twitter at Stranahan, Stranahan, and I've spelled that out so many times. Also on YouTube, check him out at populist.tv and check out Citizen Journalism School. Lee, thank you for joining us. How are you doing this morning?
Doing great. And by the way, I was excited to learn yesterday that The Backstory is also on 10 p.m. to midnight.
Oh, cool.
On Sputnik. Yeah, that's right.
Awesome.
I don't have to get up and do a second show or anything. They just rebroadcast it. But it's kind of neat that we're on later in the day as well.
That's very cool to hear. All right, we brought you on to talk about Hunter Biden, but maybe we can start with The Backstory, actually. Just tell us a little bit. What's your new show about? What kind of things do you like to talk about on there? What's been going on, and how has it been for you?
It's been fantastic. So we talk about a lot of the same stuff that I would talk about on Fault Lines. When I was co-host of Fault Lines, I had certain stories that I considered signature stories. So the Ukraine stuff we'll be talking about this morning is a good example of that. But a unique take on the Black Lives Matter situation, which I've been reporting on for about 8 years now, since roughly 2012 when the Trayvon Martin thing first started happening. I've been reporting on that extensively, and other stories that I do. So we're able to take really deep dives into stuff, and a lot of the same guests that we get on Fault Lines, obviously, because they're great. And we're able to do stuff like we had Alexander Mercouris on the other day, great guest, Alexander from the Duran. We had him on for 45 minutes and took a really deep dive into the city of London, Christopher Steele, the people that, really factor in. So it's been really great. And that's why we call it The Backstory. Our tagline is we take you to the truth behind the headlines. And this Hunter Biden story is a good example of that. But let me just put a bookmark in this real quickly, because we might want to talk about it later. I don't know if you saw this, and I think it's actually related. There was reporting that came out in the past couple days, and the Republicans are now saying, I don't know if you've seen this, that Christopher Steele was a Russian spy, and that Darshenko, his primary subsource, was a suspected Russian spy. And I actually view it as related to this Hunter Biden story in a way. But I don't know if you guys have seen that, but if later in the show you want to talk about that, I think it's very interesting and it does relate. So
that is fascinating. Yeah, I definitely will want to talk about that. I hadn't seen that. Let's talk about Hunter Biden, though. A couple of days ago, Republicans released a report. New York Times, the way they're saying this, I'll just literally read the New York Times coverage of it. Republican inquiry finds no evidence of wrongdoing by Biden. That's a quote. I can't help but feel like that's varying quite a bit. Can you tell us what was in this report and what's been going on with this story recently, Lee?
Well, yeah. For one thing, let me explain why you didn't hear about the Darshenko story. And it's a good example in this Biden story as well. The news media knows that there are two audiences out there broadly. There's the left and the right. The New York Times audience is the left, the establishment left, but that's who their audience is. And they don't try to pitch it. Now, if you've been reading right-wing sources, whether it's Breitbart or listening to Fox or listening to John Solomon, you would have thought that this Hunter Biden thing was it. Like, this is it. This is the biggest deal in the world. And so this is very common, is one side will say, bombshell, 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 and the other side yawns audibly and goes, there's nothing here. And that's what's going on here. Now, the New York Times story is technically correct because the Senate did find no specific evidence of wrongdoing. But as soon as I read the report, and I read the report as soon as I could click my greedy little fingers on it, I could see the problem. The first paragraph of the report completely glosses over the real crimes here. And there is a reason for that. And that's because both Republicans and Democrats were complicit in those crimes. And those crimes were the government of the United States overthrew a democratically elected government in the Ukraine. That's what they did. And the Obama administration did it. And nobody in the Trump administration wants to touch that with a 10-foot pole because they were in on it. A lot of them were in on it. Lindsey Graham, who a lot of people on the right are treating like a big hero now, he and John McCain were in Ukraine on January 1st, 2016. That's the day they do the big tiki torch marches. The Nazis in Ukraine, the actual Nazis, the Banderites, do those tiki torch marches. So what we learned from this Biden report was, I'm going sort of in reverse order, but number one, he likes hookers, apparently. That's one thing about Hunter Biden. And that was really in the report. They said he was giving money and consorting with women who were known to be, they were hookers, basically. They didn't come out and, they should have been a little more blunt, but hookers. And, oh, by the way, apparently the worst kind of hookers, which is Russian hookers. It's the worst kind because they're scary. I'm not commenting on the quality of the hookers. I'm just saying that those would be the most scary. Now, the other stuff that came out, the big bombshell on the right, was that he got $3.5 million wired to him by a woman who is, and again, this is going to shock you, Russian. And I want you to note by the way, I don't know what that $3.5 million is for. She's the way everyone's describing her is she's the wife of the former mayor of Moscow. And that would make her extra scary, right? Because not just Russian, but connected to a Russian official or something. And who she is she is the richest woman in Russia and has been for a decade and a half. And by the way, she's a billionaire who doesn't live in Russia anymore. She lives in London now. And by the way, that's where the interesting part of the story is to me is London. That's why I mentioned Mercouris earlier. But she's interesting. And I can't really figure her out exactly. I don't know why she gave the money to Biden, but she is one of the only self-made from scratch woman billionaires in the world. If you look at the list of women billionaires and you took out the people who inherited their money, she moves to the top of the list and she built it from scratch. And from what I've seen, it seems like she may have made that money legitimately. It doesn't seem like she made it through some oligarch scheme or something. But again, I don't know her well enough. And reading about her, it's an interesting story. But I can't tell. But I do know she lives in London now and has for some time. And we don't know why. But that's, all the right needed to see was, look, he got money from a woman who's from Russia. And that's it. And they get to point and go, oh, see, the Democrats are the ones who are colluding with Russia. And that's what I've always said on the story, is this is really about demonizing Russia, no matter what side you're on.
That seems very clear. Looking into her background a little bit, plastics company, and the timeline for those payments between May and December of 2015. Can you fit that in? Is there any relevance to when that happened in terms of Biden working with Burisma? Again, you're saying this is kind of coming out of nowhere, and it could just be like you were hinting at the end, anti-Russian propaganda, this time from the right. But in terms of the story, do you think that there's any more to it than that, Lee?
No, I mean that's the thing. When the New York Times says there's no evidence of wrongdoing, he got a large amount of money from this woman. That is pretty clear. I don't know why, but it's interesting. It doesn't seem like the Senate really investigated this. Like, for instance, did they ask Hunter Biden? Here's what this was. This was a mop-up operation by the Republicans. So they can say, we looked into Hunter Biden and we issued a report. And we didn't find anything. I've said this from the beginning. You know this, Shane, because you've had to hear me pontificate in free time as well. I've said from the beginning, nothing's going to come of this Hunter Biden thing. This is not the real story. The real story is the coup that was fomented by people on the right like John McCain and Lindsey Graham, the entire Obama administration, people like Victoria Nuland, right? That's the story. And they don't want anybody to talk about that. That's the part you're not allowed to talk about.
Is that really the story?
This whole Hunter Biden.
I mean, if you think about
say again, Jamal?
Is that really the story? If you think about U.S. politics, Obama, the New York Times will put on the front pages that basically the Obama administration spent $1 billion to try to undermine and take down Bashar al-Assad. They would display on the New York Times basically that the U.S. was paying all of this money to basically jihadists to go into Libya and to take down that government. We would openly talk about how we used air power working with Britain in order to basically topple the government of Libya. I guess I'm asking, is the coup thing really something that the U.S. cares all that much about? Meaning, is that the real story? Under how we tend to operate in regards to the country and in regards to press, coups tend to be something that, at this point, we talk about. And, you know, in the old days, we used to be kind of dicey about that. We used to let the CIA handle that stuff. But in these days, it doesn't seem to be something that we're all that dicey about accepting, let's say, in this kind of wink and nod way. Am I wrong on that? Meaning, it's a coup that took place in Ukraine. Would that really be mind-blowing to the American audience? Or would that really be something mind-blowing? Or is it really, look, this is accepted policy at this point that the public accepts with a wink and a nod?
Well, it depends what the meaning of real is. If you're asking, will it outrage the public? I actually kind of think that the public on both sides, on the left and the right, broadly, are tired of interventionist wars. Generally speaking, that's one thing that I see that people really, when you ask them about it, they don't like. And they don't like regime change wars, and they don't like coups. So while it was a pretty open coup, what I mean by real in this is, if you want to understand what was happening in Russiagate, you have to understand the role of the Ukraine coup in it, because it was part of a move to demonize Russia. And I think a lot of people do want to get it. Now, the spin on both sides, left and right, is that the Democrat spin is the Russians are evil and Trump colluded with them. The Republican spin is Russia's evil and Trump didn't collude with them. And if people want to step back and look at it, both Russia's demonized in both of those cases. The analogy I would make in the Ukraine situation is, Jamal, if I did a home invasion and I took over your house and I threw you and your family out, okay? So now I'm in your house. And then while I'm in your house, I also use all of the ketchup, right? The big story there is not man uses all of the ketchup. And that's what the Burisma story is to me. Once you've done the coup, once you've taken it over for economic purposes, a little bit of nepotism, who cares at that point? That's not really the big issue. People died. I mean, let's point out, people died in this and were killed, it seems like, by snipers that were brought in by the pro-EU side. So that, to me, is a bigger story, and no one's talking about it. So I think most people don't actually understand at all what happened there. If they think about it, they would, but they're so distracted by the Russia stuff. And again, on both sides, you know how people like Rachel Maddow have obsessed about this. Well, people on the right do it too. And it's disgusting because it's so wrong. But,
so let's do this. Let's bring you back. Because I think I slightly disagree with you on this. Not about the coup part. The coup is right. I think I disagree with you about public interest. So this is Lee Stranahan, Sputnik News analyst and host of The Backstory, airing Monday through Friday on Radio Sputnik from 4 to 6 p.m. Eastern. You can follow Lee on Twitter at Stranahan and at YouTube at Populist TV and Citizen Journalism School. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We'll be back in a moment.
Fault Lines
This is Radio Sputnik.
By Any Means Necessary is your guide to the movement and efforts shaping the world around us, from mass incarceration.
No longer am I interested in or concerned with prison reform. I am interested only in the eradication of prisons.
To the battle between police and water protectors.
It was a pretty punishing disregard for the sanctity of human life, that unleashing water cannons on peaceful, prayerful water protectors.
From efforts to protect the environment.
The climate movement is ready to, with plenty of opposition research and force and strength, along with, the right of both science and morality, to fight them on this.
To the movement for Black Lives.
When I first saw the Michael Brown video, and I saw that it clearly contradicted the narrative put forth by the Ferguson Police Department and by police supporters in general, 3 words came to mind. Color me shocked.
Stay tuned to By Any Means Necessary, 5 days a week here on Radio Sputnik. Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm joined by my co-host, Shane Stranahan. We're joined by Lee Stranahan, Sputnik News analyst and host of The Backstory, airing Monday through Friday on Radio Sputnik from 4 to 6 p.m. Eastern. Lee get to do what we always do on Fault Lines. We get to argue a bit. So I think I disagree with you. I think on the outward left, meaning let's say on the non-establishment left and the non-establishment right, then yes, I think they are sick of regime change wars. But I think they had always been sick of regime change wars. I mean, if you look at Rand Paul or Ron Paul, those guys have always been against this notion of these kind of interventionist wars. And if you look at the left, they were the same way. Establishment Democrats and Republicans, I don't think they care one way or the other. I think they consider this is just the par for going forward. In fact, if you look at the Obama types and the Clinton types and the Biden types, and if you look at the same thing on the Republican side, the Jeb Bushes of the world, they are fully on board for this notion of business as usual, whether that's in South America, whether that's in Middle East. And the people who they put in office, they may feign that stuff. Don't get me wrong. Like if you listen to, they would say, yeah, we believe in freedom in this place and everything else. But what that means is we need more troops in Syria. We need to keep them there. We need to keep those troops in Afghanistan. We need to keep those troops in this place of Africa and that place. And we need to keep policies that are taking place right now, like in Venezuela, where we have a certain degree of control over those nations. I don't think that the majority of the American public is on board to stop the regime change stuff. I think they just don't want to necessarily be made entirely aware of it, even though they accept it with a wink and a nod. Tell me I'm wrong, Lee.
Well, let's separate out politicians from people. Let's just separate out politicians from, actual human beings, which, by the way, is always a good idea, since they may be a different category altogether. But let's separate out elected officials who, by definition, are, if you're an elected official, in one very real sense of the word, you are the establishment, right? I don't care what you are the establishment because you're elected, you're making laws, you're passing things, you're part of the establishment. Let's separate that out from the people. Here's my view of the world. For thousands of years, basically, people have been ruled by elites, kings, monarchs, so on. And that really started to change in like the 18th century with the American Revolution, French Revolution, rights of man, people talking about that. And ever since then, the elites who have run the world have been scared to death. Look at the fact that Queen Elizabeth, we had a revolution, no more kings, that kind of thing. Well, Queen Elizabeth still is the head of state of 19 countries right now. So the elites are still around, but they've kind of morphed. So they've now merged with the business class, and that's why you get people like Soros, who is a hedge fund manager who funds the left, but he is a capitalist, period. And for instance, that's a good example of the new elite, right? And he does it through non-government organizations and stuff like that. So they've been in a panic because in the past 10 years, suddenly, if you had heard about, because I just turned 55. So when I grew up, I would hear about the Council on Foreign Relations and Bilderberg and, the Trilateral Commission and all this stuff. And it just sounded whack. It just sounded crazy. You'd hear it on late night radio. And that's because you had no way to actually research it yourself. Now, with the advent of the internet and everybody walking around with a supercomputer with a camera and, in their pocket, basically, your phone, you can research this stuff. If you hear somebody go, Bilderberg, and you're like, well, that sounds wacky, you can look it up on your phone and go, hey, they're not only real, they have a website. And if you're part of the power elite, this scares the bejesus out of you because you now see that you can be exposed. And so there's a massive propaganda war going on that we're all marinating in. We're all soaking in that. And so part of that is to keep the same underlying message going to the left and right. But I see more and more people. You can't expect people to wake up overnight because the people doing the propaganda are smart and they understand psychology. They understand mind control and stuff like that. And I don't mean that in a scary way because mind control ultimately doesn't work. Ultimately, it doesn't work. But it can definitely work for a while. You can fool some of the people some of the time. You can't fool all the people all the time, as the great American president Bob Marley once said. So that effect is having less and less effect on people. My job would be so much easier if people would be instantly smarter and less susceptible to propaganda. But again, we're marinating in it. And when you consider the propaganda machine starts from the day you enter school and goes on with every ad you watch and all throughout the culture and songs and TV shows and news and everything else, it's difficult to overcome sometimes. But my sense is when you ask people, when you talk to people, forget the polls or anything like that, and forget who's elected. When you talk to people, don't most people you talk to, be honest, Jamarl, when you talk to individual people, don't most of them really not like these regime change wars and they know something's up, but they can't quite put their finger on it? I'm talking about people who aren't political weirdos like we are, who think about this stuff a lot.
Yeah,
I'm just talking about normal
people,
human beings.
Most random people will say, I don't like it.
Yeah.
Just any random person.
Point, so.
And then those people will go and vote for monstrous people who will go and do those things. Meaning them saying, I don't like it, it's not hardcore. They don't like it in the kind of objective sense. In the kind of like, if I'm just thinking about the world, I don't like it. But when you get into brass tacks, they would accept it, especially if it means Donald Trump doesn't get back in office. Or if it means that Hillary Clinton doesn't get in office. You know what I mean? I'm saying like they don't accept it in this kind of flesh to bone way of where they recognize that people are being killed and slaughtered, etc. They say it, oh yeah, I don't agree with it, in kind of a, ethereal, flimsy way. I'm talking about anti-war stuff, like the Vietnam War, where you had all those people going out saying, we are against this. That doesn't seem to be there. It doesn't seem to burn in people.
Well, remember, even with Vietnam, it never quite was that way. In other words, there were always people. Now, again, you did see it. When we've had Medea Benjamin on Fault Lines, when I used to host Fault Lines, I asked her about that because she was obviously key in the big anti-war movement. Even forget Vietnam, Jamarl. Go back to Iraq. When the invasion of Iraq happened, there were fairly sizable anti-war protests. And that's why so if you're analyzing...
I was a part of them. You might remember I was about 12 years old. I was a part of them back in 2004.
Me too. I was in Austin, and I know you and your mom. I know, Shane, you and your mom were, and me and my family, your stepmom and stuff like that. We were in Austin. We were out there with the kids and stuff like that as well. So you use the term lazy, Jamarl. I'm going to disagree with that for a second. Well, I used to work for a high-tech company. The company that makes the cameras in the studio. It's called New Tech. And the tech support people would sometimes talk about the customers, and they would call them lazy people because they'd say, well, they called me because they're having trouble making their video toaster work or whatever, and they didn't read the manual. RTFM was a tech support mantra, which is read the effing manual. But one day, one marketing person, we were in a meeting, and they said, stop calling our customers lazy. They're not lazy. They're busy. And that's what's going on. As Harvey Pekar once said, real life is rough. The work of living just a normal life, forget politics, getting the kids to school, working, relationships, all that stuff is brutal. It just is. Day-to-day life is very difficult. And so if people decide to spend a half hour a day thinking about politics, or God bless those people, because they're really putting in bonus, extra credit work. Just the day-to-day life of most people is very, very difficult. And again, you are surrounded by propaganda. We know, for instance, the CIA spends millions of dollars promoting TV shows and movies. That's so when you relax, when you're living your day-to-day life and getting the kids to school and getting to work, when you go to relax at the movies, you've still got this subtle pro-war propaganda, sometimes not subtle. When you go to the Smithsonian Museum, you get the propaganda. So I really don't. I don't view it as lazy. I view it as people are busy, and then the job becomes for people like us in the media trying to tell the.
I'm pretty sure I didn't use that term lazy. In fact, I'm almost certain I didn't use the term lazy. I could look back over the video because usually I take the same point of view that people are.
I think you might have.
They have a busy life. And in the context of a busy life, you have all of this political stuff that many people don't necessarily pay attention to. But either way, I'm just trying to get to the point that either way, this public, our public, whether we like it or not, is amenable to, let's say, whether you want to call it propaganda, which, yeah, I agree with you, it is, that tells them, even their political leaders will go out and say, either Democrat or Republican, they would come out with a reason that they needed to go bomb, kill, and blow stuff up. And they may cut it to the left and cut it to the right, but they're still cutting it in a particular way that the public says, okay.
Yeah, well, that's what their job is. Their job, someone once said, when people say, oh, they don't care about what I think, the government doesn't care about what I think, they said, no, that's all they care about. From the time you get up in the morning, they're spending trillions of dollars to affect your opinions on stuff. And that's what everybody's facing, is a multi-trillion-dollar propaganda industry that's worldwide and that's designed to keep the elites in power. So that's what you're up against.
At the end of the day, Lee, at the end of the day, thank you for joining us. I'm glad that we're on the same side trying to fight back against that, misinformation, against that propaganda. Thank you for joining us.
Yeah, you bet. Thanks for having me, guys.
All right, we're out of time. That was Lee Stranahan, Sputnik News analyst and host of The Backstory. That airs Monday through Friday on Radio Sputnik from 4 to 6 p.m. Eastern and from 10 to midnight. That's p.m., by the way. We'll be back on Monday. Thanks, everybody, for this week. Thanks for listening. Thanks to engineer Andre, producer Raheem, and, of course, thank you to my great co-host, Jamarl Thomas. Have a great weekend, folks. See you on the other side.
All right, guys. Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Yeah, this is the end of the week. I hope you guys are doing great. Look, you guys are going to see me later today. I will be back on for multiple shows, and I will talk to you then. Thanks all. I'll see you guys.